Greetings. Welcome, everyone. I'd like to call to order the 175th meeting of the New York State Board for Historic Preservation. Thank you for your attendance. We'll begin the meeting with the roll call.
Okay, Doug Pirelli.
Present.
Jennifer Lemack. Here. Erica Krieger. Here. Paul Stewart. Here. Wynne Aldridge. Here. Chuck Vandry. Present. Kristen Herron. Here. Lucy Waletsky. Here. Oh, she is?
Yeah.
Good. And Wayne Goodman has jury duty, and Jay DiLorenzo was not able to make it. And Michael?
That concludes the roll call. Director Michael Lynch would like to say a few words to start us off.
Normally, this is Kathleen Martenza's slot, but I'm filling in for her because she's away this week. She wanted me to remind the board that the actions of the board require a majority vote of the full board, not just the majority of those present. So we have 8 present today. That means anything to pass needs 7 votes. If it doesn't receive 7 votes, either pro or against, it goes away. So that's my only announcement. Vote 7 times or it doesn't go.
Thank you, Michael. Now we move to approval of the December minutes, which have not been in our hands for a real long time, but
I just have one edit to them.
we have an edit for the December minutes. Lucy, please.
Yes, page 5, Lawrence Rockefeller. Lawrence is spelled wrong in 2 places. It's Laura and CE. Yeah, and no W. Yeah.
Name for his grandmother, am I right?
Yeah, Laura.
Any other comments about the December minutes? Do we have a motion to approve the December minutes? Paul? Second? Erica? All in favor? That's an approval of the December minutes. As is our custom, I'd like for the board to introduce themselves briefly. Our crowd changes from meeting to meeting. We're on camera. I think it's important for the audience to know who we are. I'm Doug Pirelli, Clinical Assistant Professor of Anthropology at the University of Buffalo. I also serve as President of the New York Archaeological Council and Chair of the State Review Board.
Kathleen LaFranc. I'm the Secretary to the Board.
Erica Krieger, I am representing the Secretary of State. I am the Assistant Director at the Department of State Codes Division.
I'm Kristen Herron. I am Program Director for Architecture and Design and Museums at the New York State Council on the Arts, and I am the proxy for our chair.
I'm Paul Stewart, and I'm here somewhat in my connection with the Underground Railroad History Project. And
I'm Jennifer Lemack. I'm the Chief Curator of History at the New York State Museum and the Commissioner of Education's proxy.
I'm Chuck Vandry. I represent the Commissioner of Environmental Conservation, and I'm the agency's Historic Preservation Officer.
I'm Lucy Waletsky. I'm Chair of the New York State Council of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation.
And Wynne Aldridge, former Deputy Commissioner for Historic Preservation at State Parks, and I think I've been attending these meetings since before such a board existed, and it was just the Committee on Registers in the mid-1970s.
Lucky for us to have you
Indeed.
all that time.
Thank you, Wynne.
I'm Daniel McKay, Deputy Commissioner for Historic Preservation. Let me also acknowledge that our new State Parks Commissioner, Eric Kulisade, will be attending, arriving approximately 11 a.m. this morning. So,
Thank you, Daniel. Moving to the next item, which is National Register reviews. Correct?
Yep.
All right. And the first review is going to be the Alderson Rey Manufacturing Building in Buffalo, New York, by Virginia Bartos.
Okay. I'm going to present this one. It's actually, can you hear me here? It's Jennifer Walkowski's project, so she's going to be available to answer questions. And then after my presentation, the consultant, Kerry Trainor, is here. Right, right here, and then she's going to make a brief presentation, and then you're free to discuss it. Okay, so, whoops, sorry, trigger happy. The building proposed for nomination is the Alderson Rey Manufacturing Building, which is located at 1491 Niagara Street in Buffalo, in a commercial industrial corridor largely defined by properties from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Alderson Rey Company was an important manufacturer of copper and brass products in Buffalo during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The company was founded in 1879 by Seymour Aldrich. In its early years, it operated at 2 different locations on Perry Street and Washington Street. In 1884, Isaac A. Aldrich entered the firm, and in 1886, George A. Rey was admitted as a partner. The company moved to 1491 Niagara Street in 1888, and shortly thereafter, Aldrich and Rey built its first manufacturing facility on the current site. And this is an 1889 Sanborn map showing the original 4-story factory, which is on the left. And then you should also note the 2-story police station, which is on the right side of the image. Less than a year later, in 1893, this factory was completely destroyed by fire. Now, after the 1893 factory, the company purchased the adjacent site to the north, which is the location of the police station, and the police station had either been destroyed or seriously damaged in the same fire. And it's very difficult to tell what actually happened to the police station from newspaper articles. Some say it was destroyed, while others say it was seriously damaged. Now, this is an 1894 atlas, and as the nomination notes, it's inconsistent with the timeline because it appears to show the site before the fire. It shows the original 4-story factory and the 2-story police station, and it says it's 1894. However, we know that they burned in 1893, the year before the atlas was published. So we agree with the nomination author that this map must actually show the site in 1893, and what may have happened is the atlas was prepared before the fire and it wasn't updated before the atlas went to press. This rendering, which is circa 1900, shows that by 1900, Aldrich and Rey had constructed a U-shaped building more than twice the size of the original. Now, there are no photos of the completed building, and I guess many archives sources have been found, and none of the completed building have been, no photos of the completed building have been found, but this rendering suggests that the newly expanded building embodied a consistent unified design, and that the new building may have incorporated a portion of the front wall of the police station. If you look to the left side of the picture, on the first floor, under the sign that says office, you can see that the first floor windows of the north side are different. And that may be the first floor of the police station that was incorporated into the design. It's hard to tell. 2 wings, 11 and 19 bays deep, extend back from the main block on either side of the drive-through, where you can see somebody is actually driving through there in front of the streetcar. Now, this rendering is supported by the 1900 Sanborn map, which shows the same configuration and shows that the offices are now in the northwest quadrant, up at the upper right-hand side of the building, which seems to have the same outline as the police station, while the rest of the building is laid out for manufacturing and storage. And you can see the drive-through there, and you can see that the building is connected on the upper stories. A 4th floor was added to the south wing in 1904, and again, there's no historic photo, but the maps confirm this. Oops. Okay, this is the Alderson Rey Company and its successor firm, the George A. Rey Manufacturing Company, occupied this U-shaped building until 1953. And you can see on this 1950 Sanborn that George A. Rey still occupied most, but not all of the building, and a series of Sanborns indicate that the building remained entirely intact to its construction period. The same U-shaped configuration that you saw in the 1900 building is evident here, the same drive-through, the same connection, the same layout of spaces. This configuration remained intact as built until 1954. This is a 1961 Sanborn. And in 1954, a one-story gantry crane building was added in the southeast corner by a subsequent company. That's the little gray addition that you see on the bottom left. And that company was the Fetters Quiggin Company, and here it is in real life. These maps show that well into the mid-20th century, all of Aldrich and Rey and its successor companies' functions were carried out in the U-shaped complex, and that the building retained its architectural integrity as a typical late 19th century industrial factory. In 1976, while under the ownership of the S.A. Day Company, the entire north half of the building was destroyed by fire, leaving only the south wing of the former Aldrich and Rey Company and the 1954 addition added by a later company. And that's what you see here, the north wing and the little wing, and that's what survives today. And here, this is this shows all 4 floors of the current building. Okay. So we've drawn, there's the building that survives today with the wing, and there's the 1900 rendering, and we've kind of tried to draw an arrow through so that you can see what part of the building survives today. In our opinion, the fragment that remains, which is about half of the historic Aldrich and Rey factory, does not retain sufficient integrity to illustrate either a typical late 19th century manufacturing complex or the operation of the Aldrich and Rey Company during the period of significance. At no time during the Aldrich and Rey Company's history, or during the period's historic period of industrial use, which is 1894 to 1954, did it ever resemble what exists today. What exists today represents the building's history only from 1976, the date of the fire. So now how did we make that evaluation? Well, we used this bulletin, How to Apply the National Register Criteria. And there are 2 steps to establishing eligibility. The first one is a building must represent a significant historic theme. And in this case, that theme is industry. So we feel that the draft nomination has more than enough information to support the claim that Aldrich and Rey is a significant local industry. So therefore, it meets test 1. The second test is that a building must have enough integrity to illustrate that significant theme. So in this case, can the building illustrate the industrial history of Aldrich and Rey Company? So here we turn to Section 8, how to evaluate the integrity of a property. In Section 8, the National Register gives us 7 measures for judging integrity, and they are location, setting, design, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. And it requires that a building must meet 4 of the 7 measures to be eligible for listing. And those 4 should be the ones that are most important to illustrate the significant theme, again, in this case, industry. And 2 of the 4 must be feeling and association. When we establish the relevant integrity measures, we also look at the relative rarity of the building type. If something is the only surviving example of its type, for example, if it were the only factory left in a small village where that industry was the major employer for everyone in the village, then we're allowed to be a little bit more lenient when we look at integrity. However, if there are many examples of a certain type of resource, then we are required to be stricter about the integrity required as we look at multiple examples of that type in a certain locale. And unfortunately, late 19th century industrial buildings with typical mill construction are not particularly rare in Buffalo. Thus, we are limited to a relatively strict reading of the integrity criteria for this resource. The other very important consideration is the period of significance. In order to meet the eligibility criteria, a building must retain the character that it had during the period of significance. So if we go through the 7 integrity measures for this proposal, first of all, we can all agree that it retains integrity of location and setting. So that means we have 2 of the 4 that we need. The next 3 are related, and they are integrity of design, materials, and workmanship. Workmanship is more about craftsmanship or design innovation, and it really isn't relevant to a building like this one. But design and materials are. Design is defined as the combination of elements that create the form, plan, space, structure, and style of a building. So if you look at the rendering and you look at what we have left, you can see that the surviving wing has only half of its original design, half of the form, half of the space, half of the plan, half of the structure, and by extension, half of the materials as the original. And if we look at functional integrity, which would be the spaces needed to represent the history of a manufacturing building, crucial parts of the building in which the manufacturing functions occurred are gone, as is the office, which is arguably one of a business's most important spaces. The part of the building that remains is half of the factory that was designed, constructed, and used by Alderson Rey. We believe that the wing is essentially a fragment of the original factory and that it does not retain integrity of design or materials. Okay, so what about feeling and association? For a building to be eligible, it must retain integrity of both feeling and association. Association is the direct link between the building and its historic theme during the period of significance. Since the building did not achieve its current appearance until 1976, long after Alderson Rey and its successor firm stopped using the building, we believe that the building does not retain its significant association with the Alderson Rey Manufacturing Company during the period of significance. Feeling is a much more subjective measure, and it's difficult to quantify, but it refers to the property's expression of the historic sense of the period. With only half of what existed remaining, without the company offices, without the drive-through and yard, we believe that the fragment lacks the feeling of the 20th century factory that operated on this site for more than 80 years. Okay, so what about the nomination itself, the one that was submitted? The draft nomination argues for significance under criterion A in the area of industrial history. As I noted, we feel that the draft meets the first test very well. We agree that it contains more than enough information to support the claim that Alderson Rey was a significant local industry. However, the nomination did not try to make the case that the surviving fragment is intact enough to represent the history of Alderson Rey. Instead, the nomination presents a different argument, that the building fragment alone is significant because only the south wing was constructed for Alderson Rey. The draft states that the north wing, the part of the building that was destroyed by fire in 1976, was not an important part of the building because it was adapted from the earlier police station. We do not believe this is a valid argument. The Sanborn maps confirm that after the 1893 fire, an expansive U-shaped factory was constructed that housed all aspects of the company's offices and manufacturing functions throughout the rest of its existence. Whether or not the newly expanded U-shaped factory incorporated a portion of the former police station is irrelevant. The Sanborn maps prove that the entire building as developed, either adapted or constructed after the fire, is what was used by the company and what represents that company's history. In addition, the north wing was the location of the company's offices, a vital part of its operation. We do not believe an argument can be made that supports the significance of the surviving wing alone as an industrial building, when it was clearly part of a large integrated design scheme for a factory that incorporated all aspects of the manufacturing process. So that's our presentation. The question that we have for you is the building associated with a significant theme? And if the answer is yes, does it retain enough integrity to the period of significance to illustrate that theme using the 7 integrity criteria? And now I want to introduce Kerry Trainor. You've seen many of her nominations, and she will give, her slides are loaded right after this, and she will give her presentation, and then we can debate it. And let me get out of your way for a second, Kerry.
Good morning.
Morning.
I appreciate having the opportunity to speak with you today. Keep this image in mind. I'm going to end my discussion referencing back to this, but I don't have it as nicely illustrated in one slide. Okay. That's all right. So a lot of the first part of my presentation, I'm not going to make. Kath did a fabulous job giving you some background context to the history and development of this property. I do want to add that the Alderson Rey Manufacturing Company represented a late 19th century manufacturing company. They made copper and brass stuff for kitchens and hotels, urns and kettles and soda fountains. They were the largest manufacturer of these goods in the state. And they operated out of this location through their history until the 1950s, early 1950s. So criterion A, as Kath described, is what we are arguing. And the notion of a local history of the Niagara Street corridor. But I do want to also quote from the National Register, at least part of it. It's getting the... that properties can have significance if it's only local. It doesn't have to be state significance or national significance. A property on its own, for its contribution to a local significance, the industrial corridor, and the community. And we argue that, or we're in the position that the Alderson Rey building is really important for local history, especially along the Niagara corridor, which, and I'm not going to go into it, with the development of transportation, the Erie Canal, Niagara Falls Boulevard, electricity, this whole industrial notion. This street went from being rural and domestic to being industrial. So it was an industrial corridor, and there's been a significant loss along this corridor. And so those resources that exist actually are rare from a local standpoint on Niagara Falls Boulevard. Yes, the rest of the city has these resources. We are talking about specifically the context of Niagara Falls Boulevard. Ooh. And so you've seen these, the 1894 atlas versus the 1889 Sanborn map showing the police station. So, the question becomes, it's okay, I'll make it through. What I ask you to consider, and what we begin to question and argue, how much material fabric is enough to illustrate the significant aspects of the past? And so we are talking about these 7 qualities of integrity, especially when you're thinking about it at a local context. We're not saying national, we're not saying state even. We're saying that this building, the portion that's left, was constructed in 1894 by this manufacturing company, specifically for use. And the argument is, well, did they connect to the police station? We actually believe that they did, and I'm going to show you why in a second. The second question becomes, is there sufficient fabric at this building to tell this story, specifically about pre-1900, small, relatively small. They only employed 40 people. So this was a very small industry, but it was, the largest in the state for production. And so my question comes back to, how do we consider resources that have also suffered loss and are listed on the National Register? This is the Seagull Phoenix Brewery in Buffalo, New York. Do I have a pointer? Yes. Look at this point right here. See that? Here's a Sanborn map that illustrates that it occupied a major portion of the block. It's east of Main Street along Washington, just south of Virginia in Buffalo, New York. And this is what was listed on the National Register. It was listed in locally, or state in 2017, and on the National Register in 2018. This is the FN Burt factory building. It's another one of those seemingly interesting history. It has an interesting history in terms of its CEO. It added on this part, I've got a slide to show in a second, but look at this portion right here. And they manufactured small stand-up boxes. They have a much larger complex in Buffalo that is at 500 Seneca. That is also listed, so it's not the only example. And you can see here that here is the building that they constructed. And they occupied these two buildings that were for the Baines Carriage Works. These two were demolished in 1940, so they were part of that building during its period of significance. And it's located right across the street from Aldrich. And this is it today. You didn't get the rest of the view. So this is what's left. And this was listed on the National Register in 2017. All right. Okay, so yikes. So here we go. The front elevation of this building is 6 bays. The one that exists, that was constructed in 1894. It extends back the complete length. If you look at the 6 bays right here, this is all existing. 6 bays over. Not that. But it doesn't go back the full way. This was never built. It was a rendering, it was published, it was never constructed. It's an idea, an architect said, hey, this is what we want to do. Never happened. 6 bays across. You don't see the 6 bays. The 6 bays that are left are the 6 bays that were constructed and connected over. Now here I can't see the side that I need, so I'm going to go back to one of Kath's slides. So we're arguing that actually, in terms of integrity, that this property does retain sufficient integrity to meet criterion A for a locally significant building that contributes to industrial history and the context along Niagara Street. Setting, character, because it's not just the exterior character, it is that interior character. We argue that there is feeling and association. This is the early portion of the building. I'm going to show you in a second why we believe that it was connected to a police station. And materials. To convey meaning and its significance to the industrial history and context of Niagara Street. Criterion A. So I do want to zip back, and I apologize because I can't see what I want to see. Whoops. So again, think of that. It's slow. So again, remember, all of that's demolished, plus the wing that goes this way. So the only thing that's left, this is gone, and there's part of a one-story that was added later. Sorry about this. But I want to go back to another image that Kath showed that it shows what this. All right, so although you can't see it on this, right here and right here are infilled windows. Okay, they're infilled, which means they constructed this. They had windows. Then they go, oh, let's connect to the police station. They infilled the windows and they made that connection. So yes, there was a connection. However, we're arguing, and our position is that, yeah, we agree, there's portions of this building gone. However, what remains is what that company built in 1894 as their manufacturing site. So it does convey meaning about that company. And yes, they did connect to the police station, and this becomes the proof. So it actually does meet the levels of integrity required to be eligible under Criterion A, locally significant to the industrial heritage and industrial character on Niagara Street. Despite the loss, especially given the other precedents I've shown you where properties with a lot of loss were also listed. Go forward now. Leave it up here? Just a second. You think I'd be... Oh, this? Sorry. You believe I teach?
Thank you, Kerry. All right, we've seen two counterpoints to this nomination. I have a question to lead off with. Kerry, are you saying that less of this building was built than was shown in the woodcut drawing?
This drawing?
Yeah, the build.
I'm saying that what was built. So let's pretend that this rendering is partially correct, and you have 6 bays across the front. Where this line is, this building actually went back the whole length. And then something happened here where you end up with the court. So this is not accurate. The court didn't happen here because it was 6 bays across, and those 6 bays come all the way back. If you look at this wing right here, it only gives you an elevation with 3 bays, 3 windows, and that's not how what exists. What exists? 6 bays, 6 windows. So that can't be that.
It's an inaccurate rendering.
It's not. It's not telling. So then you say, well, gee, what was built? Did they do anything? Did they just connect to the police station? And it was just a police station.
And this is not something that we can glean from the Sanborn maps?
No, we know that they did build something. We know that it stayed 3 stories. We know that they didn't add a 4th story to the police station. I'm still calling it the police station. Mm-hmm. No, we really don't know. We don't know what happened. We know that it suffered in a fire, but you know the thing is too that you've got these hoods that are definitely 1880s construction. That's not the detailing that you would find necessarily. And why would you detail this differently than what you're doing here if you're trying to make a unified elevation?
Okay, we've received the form and we've seen 2 presentations about this. Does the board have any questions or comments that they'd like to make? Please.
A question. The rendering is 3 stories and this building here is 4. Why is that different?
It received a 4th story on the right-hand side in 1904.
And is that construction within the period of significance?
Yes.
Period of significance and when the company left the property, when they closed up shop and sold it.
Question, please. Paul.
Could you recap for me what this building gains by being on the National Register?
Can I?
With somebody, I mean,
no, I can't.
Tax credits, I don't know, whatever, you know.
Yeah.
What's the advantage here?
So, as lots of the buildings that I just showed you, the ones at the end, the Seagull Phoenix Brewery and FN Burt, both of those were not in that condition before those images were taken. They were actually rehabilitated as part of the tax credit program. This property here would like to, the owner wants to restore it, restore the windows, bring it back to its historic condition. And I did show you windows at the end. We do know what those windows looked like. We have windows that remain extant, that are visible, a couple on the interior and some on the exterior. But what does exist here too, if you notice, see, you talk about the importance of this passageway. You also have one here, and that's still, I mean, there's still things that tell you story about industry in the early 19th century or the late 19th century.
Jennifer Walkowski, do you have anything that you could profitably add to this discussion?
Thank you, Doug. So I just want to discuss a few points based on some of the projects that have been thrown up here. Just to clarify, many of you have probably seen the 2 projects that were discussed. I just want to note, first of all, we've looked at a lot of different buildings on Niagara Street in general, and we first did take the approach of looking to see if there was the potential for a historic district on Niagara Street, and unfortunately, it's just a street that suffered a lot of loss, demolition, new infill, and new construction, and it really didn't rise to the level of conveying an entire street that was a National Register Historic District. I know it's also been looked at as a potentially certifiable local historic district. And again, it was determined that the historic district could not be certified by the National Park Service for meeting that low threshold for integrity. Whether or not this gets established as a local historic district is an entirely separate issue. That gets handled at the local level by the City of Buffalo, and they have an entirely separate set of criteria. They're based on the National Register criteria, but they are different and they have different requirements for their local historic districts. So I just wanted to kind of clarify sort of the process that we've looked at here for Niagara Street already. So what was mentioned was the Seagull Phoenix refrigeration house and office. Those were nominated as relatively rare examples of brewery-related buildings. Brewing was a major industry in Buffalo, Polish-German brewing industry. And unfortunately, after a careful analysis, it was really determined that so much of the historic breweries, malt houses have been demolished or significantly altered. So that was really a very rare intact example. And really, we did not nominate that as a brewery. It was nominated, as the name suggests, as a refrigeration house and office, because those specific parts of the building were intact to that function and that significance. So just to clarify that. FN Burt Factory C was nominated as an example of a reinforced concrete daylight factory from a very specific era. As Kerry mentioned, there is a much larger complex at 500 Seneca Street, which was also listed on the National Registers. That was really the hub of their operations. It contained their offices, their major production spaces, and as far as we can tell, that Factory C was one of at least 4 known factory sites that was largely used for warehousing and sort of supplementary processes to the company. And I did go through the nomination. It actually mentioned that the nominated build, the Daylight Factory component was built in 1911. And as early as 1960, the nomination states that the northern older portions of the Factory C that were shown in one of the drawings that were featured there were ordered to be demolished. And the company may or may not have utilized those older portions of the building. It's really unclear after that order to raise the buildings. It seems that they focus more of their operations at that site in the nominated factory site. So I just wanted to kind of clarify those examples, that they're a little bit different than what we're dealing here. Those were individually nominated for separate reasons, so.
Please.
I'm not sure if I ultimately have a question at the end of this, but I'm just kind of wrestling with the different points. So for me, in thinking this through, precedent was definitely one of those factors I've been thinking about, and so I appreciate presentation and the rebuttal, if you will, about I feel like this isn't working, so I'm just going to speak because I can be loud.
Yeah, that's fine.
The 2017 nominations that were referenced. So precedent is definitely a factor for me in thinking about how to wrestle with this nomination. The other factor for me is evidence, and so what I struggle with is, the more I think about it, is that top image to me is almost irrelevant to this discussion, right? Because it wasn't what was built. We don't know that. I mean, it's not. Like, I try to factor them together, and they're just not. So it comes back down to what the physical evidence is. At least this is how I'm processing it, I guess.
No, I appreciate that.
So I guess to pull some kind of question out of my process here is there a different argument for this remaining building that would make it a stronger case to the National Register unit?
Thank you, Jen.
I think that's my question.
Well, that's your evidence there.
What do you mean by that? Could you explain?
I'm just saying, is there a different case to be,
Jen,
like, if
could
this
you-
were written and case made
Jennifer,
differently,
would you
would there be a
explain
different
this,
response?
please? This is the evidence.
So, You're all right. Illustrations can sometimes be inaccurate. You know, they're exaggerations. They're often done by companies that aren't even in Buffalo or somewhere else. So, you know, we always take those with a bit of a grain of salt. However, Sanborn maps, you may or may not know, were for fire insurance. So they really relied on being accurate with those. And we have multiple, you know, Sanborns, as we've documented, that really show the footprint and outline what was constructed. So we do have, and I'll try to outline it as best as possible, you know, there's this wing here that was added, and you'll see these threes. That indicates it's a three-story building. This here, these symbols indicate that there was a pass-through, so like a tunnel of sorts with building up above. So again, that's sort of similar to what we saw in the rendering. Here, this again, 3 stories, this block here, and then there's a wing that extends all the way back down to here that's 3 stories. This symbol here indicates that this is a shed or a stable or something like that. So, I mean, essentially, and I understand it's hard to see on these drawings because there's lots of symbols and stuff all over it, but you have this roughly U-shaped building here that was documented on the 1900 through the 1961 Sanborn maps. So just to clarify, whether you want to look at the rendering and use that as a visualization, I mean, this is really your depiction of what was constructed.
No, that's definitely helpful, Jennifer. So, and I'm not, but my question, which doesn't have to be towards you, it can be to anyone, is there a different argument someone would use to make this case? That from the side that is arguing this should not go forward. If you were writing this nomination and were arguing it to be supported, would you take a different tact? Or is it just, I can't see any way that this could be, I'm asking the side that says no, right? From the side that says no, is there no way that you could make the case for this? Or would you say, if I made the case, I would make the case this way?
If I
do you understand? I'm trying to understand if there's a different way around this. Yeah.
If I had been, well, let me put it a different way. When we have something that comes forward, especially if it's a proposal for a tax credit, we try our best to make the case.
Okay.
We don't start out saying, oh, let's find a way to deny this one. We always try to think of any possible way to make the case. And we reviewed this one got reviewed and reviewed and reviewed over a long period of time with multiple peer reviews with multiple staff, not just Jennifer and me, multiple staff. And we tried to find a way to make this eligible. And I think the argument that I would have tried to make is that there is enough of the surviving wing to illustrate Aldrich and Ray's history. However, I have to look at the criteria. And I looked at the 7 criteria, which 4 could I find that would support it? And that's what I did for you in my presentation. Okay, it definitely has location and setting. And it has to, even if I said it didn't have to have design and materials, which I couldn't say it did, since it has only half of its, in my opinion, design and materials. It has, you know, if I read the definition of design, which is plan, space, structure, and layout, and if you look at that, it only has half of it during the period of significance. It did not achieve its current, it never looked like, it looked like this during the period of significance. It never looked like it looks today during the period of significance. So I had to say that it does not have enough design. Then I looked at association. Does it still have its significant association with Aldrich and Rey? And since it never looked like it did today, during the period when Aldrich and Rey occupied the building, I had to honestly say no. So I felt that there was no way that it retained its significant association with Aldrich and Rey. Now, unfortunately, there's no historic picture of it between the time it was built in 1894 and the time it burned. And I'm sure that Kerry, because I know she's a great researcher, has scanned every archive, right, Kerry? And I don't know why, and we tried looking at aerial photographs as well. Jennifer is also a great researcher, and all we found was the U-shape. That's all we could see in aerial photographs historically. And that's all we could see, was that there was a U-shaped building on the site. We could not see what it looked like. So, I don't know if that answers your question, but we tried our best to find a way to say that this was eligible.
I would observe that Wint's last name matches that of the
We were
building.
wondering if there was a family
And
connection or
ask,
something.
do you have anything to offer?
Not on
even
that
tried to
point, I
find
don't
this
think there's
connection
any
to Wint.
family connection. But I would say this is a good opportunity for the board to be reminded that we sit as representatives of the National Park Service under the 1966 National Historic Preservation Act, and certainly in connection with the tax credit laws that it passed subsequently. We're sort of doing the National Park Service work. The staff is, and this board is. And I would hazard a guess that there's no state in the union that has done, over the years, a better job representing the interests of the nation as chartered through the National Park Service than the people around this table and the terrific staff at the State Historic Preservation Office.
Hear, hear.
That being the case, and in the interest of maintaining that reputation, it seems to me that we need to pay particular attention in a case where it's a tax credit project, that we don't want to be on shaky ground and then have somebody who's looking very carefully in Philadelphia or Washington and say, oh, you know, you're just saying yes to everything. I'm inclined to listen very carefully to the staff recommendations, especially as Kath has said, it's been reviewed very thoroughly and over a period of time. We really do cherish our reputation as an organization, as a function of government. This devolution has been one that's been, I think, hugely beneficial to the states, particularly to New York. And we should keep that in mind. I know much of what we do seems kind of routine, and you know, most of these nominations get routinely approved, though we look very carefully at them. But when something like this comes along, I think that it's good to have the debate, but I come down on the side of the very thoughtful analysis and recommendation of the staff.
Are you making a motion?
I will convert that to a motion then, that we deny this nomination.
All right, the motion is on the table to deny this nomination. Any further discussion?
I'm just going to say that this image really is impactful for me to understand that if I think of it as the U shape being critical, and the U shape doesn't exist.
Say that again, Chris.
That the shape, the U,
Right.
that this image now sort of is the one that's maybe more impactful to me in thinking about it. That without the U shape, you don't have the structure.
All in favor of the motion to deny?
We didn't have a
We didn't have a second.
Oh, we do need a second to that motion, absolutely. Lucy seconds the motion. All in favor?
Aye.
Raise your hand.
Is it unanimous?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you, everyone. All right, who's up next?
Well, next,
Are we going to do Eric's commissioner's announcement? Okay. Yeah, sure. All right, do you use the projector?
No.
All right, next order of business on the agenda is announcements by the commissioner.
I'm also going to try and do it without the mic, right?
Can
reaching
I
over.
ask a question of the people recording? If we're just talking naturally, are you picking up all the sound that you need? So we don't need to worry about the mic position. Stop worrying about the mics. They can hear us.
It does pick up a little bit better if the mic is closer, but we're still picking up.
Okay,
thank you.
Somebody tell.
Thank you.
Hello, good morning, everybody. I am very excited to be here today. I have actually never been to a review board meeting. It's very exciting.
And there's a light show.
And there's a light show. Everything's going on. So I just thought I'd give you a few remarks. I won't take, I know I've got a half an hour on the schedule. I'm happy to do questions as we go through, but I just have really some short remarks just to say hello to this group. And much of that I'm sure you already know, but this is part of the education of Eric to some degree. So I'm really honored and humbled to have been asked by Governor Cuomo to lead the Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. And I'm really very excited to be back working for the best and most robust park system, but also the best and most robust historic preservation system in the country. And it feels a lot like, for me, that I've come home. Not all of you know me, but you know, I grew up in the hamlet of Garrison, next to Hudson Highlands State Park, and spent many a long day climbing around on the rocks on Canada Hill, which is in that, and trying to avoid the rattlesnake population. I can tell you the rattlesnakes are alive and well in Hudson Highlands State Park. It's a good thing. Wow. My first real job, actually, was as a lifeguard at Lake Welch at Harriman State Park in 1982. And I'd like to say that was that summer there was a new rock and roll station in the New York metropolitan area called WAPP, and they were just launching that summer. And for that summer, they had a commercial-free summer. And I will tell you that a commercial-free radio station is a godsend for a lifeguard at Lake Welch. But it was a really wonderful summer, and really just part of my trajectory, it's part of the arc, I guess, at this point. So then, and I was in land conservation for a long time at the Trust for Public Land, and then I was invited to work with Carol Ash when she became commissioner, and when Lucy became State Council of Parks chair. All three of us kind of came up to the state at the same time. And then went back to the Open Space Institute, where I was very much focused on capital and actually restoration of historic carriage roads at Minnewaska with Lucy's help and leadership from other folks, and thinking a lot about how the private sector can help the park system. So that's always been part of my focus. So, and now I am here. And I am truly fortunate, obviously, to be following in the footsteps of Commissioner Rose Harvey. She is really larger than life in her impact on this agency. She's done really tremendous things, and it's intimidating for me. And I think that the best thing I can do in some ways is to continue her stewardship and maintain her success. Really, when you think about the last 8 years, the turnaround in the state park system is just nothing short of extraordinary. You know, in the last 8 years, I've spent some time with groups from other states, and you go to other states, and the story is just nothing like it is in New York. You know, they are still talking with cutbacks, trying to figure out how to deal with resource extraction issues in state parks. It's just issues that we just don't deal with here because we see our parks, we cherish them, we're investing in them, and it's really an extraordinary time to be in this agency. Just thinking about going forward. You know, I am particularly focused on ensuring the best possible visitor experience for the millions of people coming to our parks and historic sites every year for outdoor recreation, exploration, education, and relaxation. I think it's important to put yourself in the visitor's shoes. You know, when I've told friends and family that I've been nominated to be commissioner, many of them said, "Boy, I love the Adirondacks." Yeah, it's not this agency. Or I had someone else say, "I love Central Park." I'm like, yeah, that's a great park, but it's not a state park. But have you heard of Niagara Falls? You might think of Niagara Falls as a national park, but it's actually a state park. So, you know, the system is, but it goes to the fact that, you know, the visitor coming into our parks is not, they don't care really who owns it, right? It's up to us to provide the experience of that place to the best we can, and if we're doing it with partners or doing it with concessionaires or other things, it's all part of it's all the tools and the things we bring to bear to build that experience. And obviously going forth, totally clear that historic preservation and interpretation are a vital role in this mission and in the activation of parks. And I think that some of these things we're talking about, you know, partnership, partnership for leveraging people, places, and services to expand visitor services is critical to activating the historic sites. That's one of the challenges of historic sites is to get people to come back, and it's really by the programming and what we offer that's going to get people to keep coming back for more, and a lot of that can be done through partnerships, so I really want to see those partnerships expand and grow. Obviously, you know, our Cottage $5 billion industry of tax credits is one of those things that really needs to be promoted. It is, you know, New York has been at the forefront of hitting that. We are about to announce, you know, I think you're probably all aware, right, that we're about to announce hitting $5 billion in tax credits, and we're planning a big celebration. That will be something you'll hear about shortly. You know, this program is in 56 of 62 counties. It's #1 in the nation for the 4th straight year. It brings our brand, it brings the parks brand to additional communities outside of our parks. And Daniel and I have been talking about, you know, thinking about ways to really make sure the historic preservation tax credit program is being brought into the communities that are gateways to our parks. There's a real synergy there, you know, and there are lots of historic upstate communities as gateways to our parks, and we ought to be making sure that those communities are availing themselves of this so that, you know, the parks, we're not only bringing people into our parks, but we're also bringing money in and financials in to support the preservation of those communities. And I want to thank this board. It was great to see that debate, to see you all considering this issue we've just looking at, and, you know, thank you all for being here and playing the critical role you do in qualifying historic properties for the tax credit program. Going forward, we're also going to look really very carefully at access, diversity, and inclusion. It's important that, you know, our parks are open and welcoming, not just to those who know them and come frequently. We want to make sure that we reduce barriers so that our wilderness parks are comfortable places for people coming from across the spectrum of people in the state, coming from our urban areas, our underserved areas. We really need to be a 21st century system, and I'm looking for innovation and sustainability, and we're doing that with automation. I think we all need to do it with information, and I think interpretation can be really augmented by technology these days, so that's another thing I see us focusing on. And we are very much, you know, this governor has, his signature is the capital improvements he's done to the park system. And, you know, we're coming to, you know, we had Parks 2020 was our major initiative, looking at flagships and the park system generally. Obviously, I hope to be around past 2020. I think really this governor intends to continue that program, so we're beginning to transition it from Parks 2020 to Parks Forward, just so that people really understand that we're not at the end of that program, and we are going to continue to build it and grow. And then I would say here in the division, really very excited that the division is preparing to launch a statewide historic resource survey. I think that's starting by early summer, Daniel, right? And we'll survey the park systems building and historic landscape inventory to assist us with planning and stewardship. And I think it's going to be done in the next 3 years. Looking for that. And I want to thank the State Review Board again, our immensely hardworking and dedicated staff, and our fearless leader, Daniel McKay. Michael Lynch is, there he is, behind the pole over there. And division staff, again, for your, you know, it's your passion and commitment to this program that really puts us at the forefront, right? I mean, it's no accident. It's really because of the staff here that we are the #1 rehabilitation tax credit in the country, that we are #1 in terms of number of properties, resources, and districts on the state and national registers, and that we're leading the nation in the diverse selection in the country from LGBTQ sites to the newest project to address African American civil rights history in upstate New York. And this is really, it's a credit to this group and your willingness to be leaders and continue to maintain this really vital program. And, you know, there's a lot of special things happening in this agency around historic preservation. I also do want to take a second to give a special shout out to the archaeology unit led by Nancy Herder for their oversight of the Revolutionary War area burial plot in Lake George. Is Nancy here? Hi, Nancy. You volunteered on the site, and and work closely with Chuck and with all state agencies to ensure those remains were treated with the respect they deserved, and we are very grateful. It was really great to see the agencies all jumping in a coordinated fashion. And that's really it. So I just want to say, thank you for inviting me. I'm not going to stay too much longer because I'm moving around today, but it's great to be here. If there's any questions, happy to talk through stuff but continue to hear these applications because they're fascinating. Thank you.
Questions?
Let me note for the staff that Eric will be with us for several hours on April 15th, meeting the division and the staff and the programs on a specific basis.
Excellent.
So good. Thanks.
Julian, please.
Eric?
Yes.
There have been several staff members who don't know you and asking about the correct pronunciation of your last name.
This is actually fairly easy. It is, if you think of that age-old powdered fruit drink called Kool-Aid, you take a little Kool-Aid and you put an S in the middle of it and you get Kool-Aid. So that's what it is.
Kool-Aid.
Right? Very easy. Kool-Aid.
Oh, that is easy. I'll explain.
I don't mind the association. Kool-Aid is one of those warm, fuzzy memories from youth. So thanks.
Okay, are we going to do the Netherlands thing?
Oh, we're gonna do the, Netherlands?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Eric.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Say? Is that next?
Yes.
All right, next item of business is the staff report on the visit to the Netherlands by Michelle Phillips.
I am
Cordell.
not Michelle Phillips, just for clarification.
That is not Michelle Phillips.
We do not want to cause any confusion on that. Michelle is a lovely person, and she would not want that association. My name is Cordell Reeves. I'm a member of the Interpretation Unit here at People's Island. I will be talking to you about the Dutch Connection, our Dutch partnership, and I'd like to thank the State Review Board, Commissioner Kulisade, thank you for the correct pronunciation of your name, and our Deputy Commissioner, Daniel McKay, for giving us this time on the program today to talk about an important partnership which continues to yield a lot of benefits for the agency and for New York State. This partnership and the foundation for this partnership begins with the work taking place within these walls. So before we actually made contact, or rather were contacted by the Dutch government or connected to the Dutch government, we'd already begun to expand our interpretation at multiple sites and do research, writing, and look towards exhibits about our Dutch connections. This is a plate taken from a touchscreen display currently at Kralo State Historic Site for an exhibit called the Dishonorable Trade. The physical components of this exhibit are now traveling currently at Maybe Farm, but this story, this idea of talking about slavery in the Dutch Empire is something that Kralo wasn't talking about before this exhibit in any expansive way. So it expanded the story there and expanded the research we were doing about the lives of enslaved people under the Dutch, not just in New York, but worldwide. There's also Kingston, the Netherlands' third city, an exhibit currently on display at Senate House. The research had already begun on this exhibit. So in 2014, when the staff at I Love New York connected me with a Dutch tour operator, Jennifer Tosh, who wanted to talk about New York State's Dutch connections, we already had product. We already had experiences. We already had something to offer. And that conversation began to involve, we went to several meetings down in New York City. I wind up presenting at the Dutch consulate after meeting the cultural attaché at another meeting that was hosted by I Love New York. And you have a timeline of all of our Dutch contacts among your handouts if you'd like to see the details. But through the consulate, I wound up being connected with Dutch Culture and also the Cultural Heritage Agency of the Netherlands. They are essentially our counterparts in the Netherlands. The Cultural Heritage Agency advises organizations all over the Netherlands on collections issues, climate control, preservation issues. Dutch Culture is an organization which funds the spread of Dutch culture around the planet. So they go to all these institutions, organizations, and countries where the Dutch had some footprint and settlement or colony or trading post. And they form ties with them, and they actually fund cultural exchanges. And they were the ones that funded the trip that I initially went on. I was in the Netherlands for a week. in June of 2017. I was making connections with staff from the Cultural Heritage Agency, from Dutch culture, other museums and organizations. We had a couple of speaking engagements where I shared all the innovative programming that goes on here within the State Historic Site system. And we started looking at ideas for how we could work together, how we could help promote this untold story, because everyone always thinks about the British when they're talking about early New York history. They just skip over the Dutch. The Dutch become a footnote. This resulted in October of that same year, a summit meeting of 80 different individuals from organizations, museums, tourism professionals, historians, who had some connection to Dutch culture, everywhere from Schenectady down to New York City. We brought them together to discuss what new projects they're working on, new research, new ideas, new programming. And this was an entire event funded by the Dutch government through a grant from the consulate. That conversation and that meeting resulted in us launching a programming series that encompassed not just the programs going on at state historic sites, but also programs going on at small historical societies and other organizations in the region. We worked with the Hudson River Valley National Heritage Area to develop a graphic look, also a calendar website, and each entry on the calendar allowed people to see not just what the main event was, but also what else was going on in the regions. What are the other destinations? What are the other events that are going on? Where can I eat? Where can I shop? It became a little engine for a lot of smaller groups who do not have a production budget, do not have a promotion budget, to make sure that they were connecting with the state historic sites, that they were promoting events jointly, and it's become a really great partnership for us. I can't say enough good things about the Hudson River Valley National Heritage Area and how helpful they have been in moving this project forward and actually assisting with promoting this history. There was a secondary Facebook page to do event promotion, and we wound up promoting some of our own events like this on separate platforms. So not only were we having agency promotion, site promotion, but also an entirely separate group for this group from the event for Pinkster, where we had the Children of Dahomey pictured here, who came in to talk about the blending of cultures. So Pinkster begins under the Dutch as a celebration of Pentecost. It's a religious observance. For enslaved Africans, this became a time of freedom. It became a few days off where you weren't expected to work. But more importantly, it became a homecoming opportunity for friends and family to get together. You could be enslaved in one location, and a mile and a half away is your spouse and your children, and you only see them twice a year because you're not allowed to leave the property, you're not allowed to have contact with them. Pinkster becomes a time when you can reunite with your own family who you haven't seen. It may be one of 2 times per year where you have that opportunity to actually have a sense of family and community with your own music, your own food, your own dances, and spending that time with people you love. So it's an event that we have run at Cralo for 2 years. We're moving it this year to Schuyler on June 8th. Consider that an invitation for anyone who wants us to show up. We're going to have an amazing time, and we're going to have a festival there, but we're also going to share this important idea of community and reestablishing community through this event. And this idea of blending of cultures, where you have something that is distinctly Dutch blending with something that is African to create something that is completely new. The results, over 40 programs in 8 different counties, everything from lectures, culinary workshops, exhibits. Dye Mansion in New Jersey reached out to us because they saw what we were doing, and they said, we have a similar history, we have Dutch connections, how do we fit into this? How can you give us some advice on how we can actually connect up with this history, connect up with your programming series? So our reach has gone beyond the Hudson River Valley and beyond even New York State into other states, asking us for advice on how to replicate what we're doing. This has also become a professional development opportunity and an opportunity to create new scholarship. On the right, you see our senior curator, Travis Bowman. On the left, Dr. Whalen from Leiden University in the Netherlands. Travis has thought for many years that the Dutch Act of Abjuration and the Declaration of Independence have a number of ties and similarities. And Dr. Whalen feels the same way. They met last year in the Netherlands when Travis and Michelle were traveling there. And during that meeting, Dr. Whalen decided that he would visit upstate New York and look at some of the resources that are at Claremont State Historic Site. And we said, well, since you're going to be here anyway, would you like to do a talk for us? And we wound up spinning an entire program out of it. So now the research that they have both individually done is being exchanged, and both parties are going to benefit. The other professional development opportunity here is risk management, or you can call it value-based decision-making. The Cultural Heritage Agency of the Netherlands provided 2 experts at no cost to the agency to come here and discuss risk management and to do training for us. We extended this by actually contacting the Museum Association of New York and the Greater Hudson Heritage Network to make sure that others were benefiting beyond our agency borders, to make sure that other small not-for-profits would have the opportunity to sit in on this training also. And I think it's one of the hallmarks of our relationship with the Netherlands as a partner is that everything we do, whether it's risk management, whether it's some of the information exchange that we've had or the research exchange that we've had, or even meetings and roundtables and discussions, we broaden the circle. We make sure that the greatest public benefit is being met through our partners, and that information is getting out to other smaller institutions that don't have our backing, that don't have our staff levels. Because that's really what serves the public. If we can raise all ships, it benefits everyone. To date, we've received 2 grants from the Netherlands, one for the summit meeting and one for a Dutch survey project where we're looking for known Dutch historic resources within a 26-county area. We've also received things like the risk management training, which Michelle will talk a bit more about. And there's other training opportunities that are available also through the Cultural Heritage Agency of the Netherlands. It's a partnership that continues to yield benefits, and Michelle will tell you more about what the future is on this aspect. Thank you.
So my name is, while Virginia's setting up the PowerPoint, my name is Michelle Phillips. I'm the paper conservator here. For those of you who don't know me, I work down that mysterious locked away hallway. I treasure any opportunity to get out of the lab. As much as I like working with materials, it's really great to connect with people. I work with documents and paper objects all day long. So I want to thank Daniel and Michael and Chris Flagg for all the work and support for getting Travis and I to the Netherlands. No small feat. And we also had a lot of support from the executive level at 625 Broadway. So Cordell already gave you a small introduction to the Cultural Heritage Agency of the Netherlands. That's a tongue tie. We call it RCE internally. They like their acronyms about as much as we do. The other organization we were working with is Dutch Culture. They have a really interesting relationship. Dutch Culture is funded through Foreign Affairs to facilitate international cooperation for other governmental organizations in the Netherlands. And why, do you ask? Do you send a paper conservator to another country, especially to the Netherlands? Sending your curator to the Netherlands is a pretty direct jump. But why are you sending somebody who spends her day in the lab working with documents? RCE is a world-recognized innovator for the conservation of collections and how to connect the public to collections. And our agency, in my tenure here, we've been working really hard for using conservation and all those hidden core core responsibilities that we have that the public really doesn't really know about, how can we connect to the public using them? Because I tell you, at every dinner party that I'm at, when I tell people what I do, they're like, I didn't know about that. Can we come and see you in the lab? They all want to come and see conservation in action. So it's really ripe for engaging beyond the topics that we're using for interpretation, but the care of the stuff that tells those stories, that's another level for connecting to the public. So, I think Virginia, there we go. Okay. So it was a whirlwind of a week. I'm not going to talk to you about everything. They were really wonderful to create a very tailored itinerary for us. What you see on the main track is everything we did together, and then Travis and I split off, and they made a very specific paper track for us, for me, and a very specific curator track for Travis. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. It's the big benefit as a conservator was all of the material and forensic scholarship that is coming out of the Netherlands. Because what we're talking about when we're looking at documents or looking at artwork, it's not just what's on the page. It's the paper it's written on. You were talking this morning about forensics evidence. That's my wheelhouse. We discovered what you're seeing on the right here this is a transmitted light photograph of a document from the Senate House collection that we knew we had, and the New Netherlands Institute knew we had, but it was outside the period of interpretation that they're working with. And when we got them, it was we didn't realize quite how early they were. There's some documents here from the 1600s, and they directly informed the exhibition that is at Senate House right now. We have 80 documents in this collection, and they came through the lab. What you're seeing is the watermark. This is how we trace industrial production of paper, manufacturing. And so you coordinate that with what's written on the page to solidify provenance, look at things like trade routes. It actually speaks to a lot of the immaterial culture that we're focused on. It's never just about the stories or the physicality, it's always the melding of things. Whoops. So that was a municipal archives that I was, in the last slide that I was visiting with paper historians that are the dictionary of Dutch information. There's not a lot of publications. So it created all these relationships for me so that as I'm working with paper documents and I'm going to Travis about the curatorial importance, we now have expanded the forensic evidence network that we have for looking at that information. I went to the National Archives, and they are doing an incredible, they're doing incredible work of connecting people with the physicality of collections. The material fact of collections is that they're fragile. They're difficult to make accessible to the public. And with digitization, digitization provides access, but there's so much work that goes into digitizing that we could never really meet every researcher's dream, right? So they have come up with a way, this is when people can call up in their research room, they can use this to take their own photos of materials. They have an automated form for conservation to get materials into a condition so that users and scholars can come in. The person off the street gets a little bit of training about how to handle things, and they're working directly, safely, with all the security measures, with their own cultural heritage. Like, this is amazing. I just spent the last 2 days working with a researcher where I had to do all the handling for that researcher because of the way we've had to claw back the collections for security reasons, for physical handling reasons, because we can't accept a level of risk for that kind of handling. But we can get better at it. So this is their in-house conservation work. They have a lab that is actually it's about 3 times larger than the paper lab down the hallway here. They have a really great mix of employees. I don't know, whoop, I didn't even touch anything on that one. There. Okay. All right, maybe I'll let you drive. So they have a significant number of subcontracted workers doing conservation technician work. They have established government employees, kind of like, the doctors doing stuff, and then they have their fleet of nurses. And then the other thing is they're really well complemented with a relationship with conservators and private practice. This is the thing that blew my mind when I was visiting, to see this established relationship and watch the volume of conservation that is happening on historic collections. So what you're seeing here, this is how I fix stuff, right? This is a soot damage document. It's got a lot of wear and tear going on. For me to get it ready for a researcher, I have to do a lot of manual labor. That's what I signed up for. I love doing this, don't get me wrong. What you're seeing, I'm sorry you can't see what's underneath. This is a close-up of an iron gall ink document. This iron gall ink documents are really suffering across the globe. They're coming of age. They're about, these kinds of documents are hitting 150, 200 years old, and they've been suffering from high humidity. There's inherent vice in that iron. It changes ionic form. It starts bleeding through the paper, and it looks like it's eating the paper. And once it's done this, you can't really do much about getting that information back. So the conservation fields really focus on how do we stabilize this mass amount of iron gall ink documents that we have. And this company, let's see, this is a very Star Trek-y looking picture of their machine that automates structural repair. There's been a lot of research in conservation about the chemical stabilization. We know what we need to do. We know it's phytate treatment. It's a very aggressive treatment. It's a washing treatment. And the goal to do all that chemical treatment and then the structural treatment is so that you can get a document, this one, that is handleable in this way. If you can press play. We can't handle documents that haven't been repaired this way. I'm being a little heavy-handed, but understand that is my hand. I'm a conservator. They allowed me to do this. This is a document that was mold infected and so fragile that there's no way you could have flipped the page like that. So to understand what happened to that document, you have to understand leaf casting. We've been doing leaf casting in North America for about 25 years. It's a way to pulp fill holes and voids in a sheet of paper and get it back acting like a sheet of paper. Because when something has a tear or a hole in it, it stops acting like a sheet of paper, and then that's when we have to restrict handling to people who really know what they're doing. So if you can go ahead with the leaf casting. So leaf casting, those are 4 sheets of paper. They're actually supposed to be 2, but they had been broken down by holes, and there's pulp in that water, and that water is being pulled through the piece of paper. And you see the fill right there? And I kind of wish we had the sound on that one, because it's like whoosh, and pulls it through, and then you have a magic full sheet of paper again. Again, a lot of time. I've done this in my career. It's a lot of time. We're talking about maybe getting about 10 pieces done in a day with all the setup. 10, 20 if you're really good. So what they've done is they've developed this machine. This is a conveyor belt, and you can press play. These are pieces that have been leaf casted in this section. This is Anthony. He's loading documents down at this end. You can barely see, it's moving pretty slowly, but I think you can detect that. Willem is about to take, that's a repaired piece. And again, with the sound, I went, as soon as I saw that. These are documents that are now, once they're dried in size, they're going to be structurally sound. They get put back into the collection, and then they're readily available for researchers. Again, it's an aggressive treatment, but iron gall documents across the globe are in a condition now where this is acceptable. And I'm just going to show you at the tail end. At the next one, this is the finishing, because this automation doesn't replace people. But the big thing about this is it's taking your production level in a lab from getting 20 documents done in a day to 200 documents done in a day. And that, for the archives across New York State, is radical. I worked in private conservation practice before joining the state, And I've surveyed a lot of the different repositories we have, historic sites, archives, you name it. This kind of technology would be a game changer for making our documentary heritage accessible. It's not just digitizing. Digitizing becomes part of this. It's now in a state where it's stable for digitizing. It will lower the cost of digitizing. So you get, for your bang for your buck, you're getting a stable primary document, because that document will now last hundreds of years. Because that paper is still really good paper. It's just been compromised by the ink. And once you've had the washing and you stabilize the ink, it now has a longer lifespan to it. Longer than most of our technology has, right? We all, right? So yeah, so our contribution. So, because I felt like a big taker when I was there. I was absorbing all this information. So our contribution is the groups we worked with. We made a presentation to ICOMOS is their group. It's a group of professionals who are, it's a non-government group, but populated by a lot of government professionals about advancing preservation. And we made a presentation to them because they're very interested about New York State, the types of cultural organizations that we have in New York State, really interested in the network of historic sites and the interpretive potential of this network of historic sites, which really talks to what Cordell was speaking to earlier. There was a real comparison and contrast of conservation ideals in North America. Aggressive treatment for conservation, it's, again, you're gonna hear me say value-based decision-making. That's what we do every day. We try to codify it as much as we can, but there's also always that special case scenario. So how can we make sure we're pulling that in and getting it to in an efficient workflow pattern? So operational challenges, you heard me talk about how to make collections accessible. And a real big one for me is using conservation and the hands-on collections care to get buy-in at the staff level and at the public level. You know, stewardship, people love the stuff. They want to work with the stuff, and many hands makes light work. And you know, I wish I had 6 of me in the lab. And then continuing our training partnerships, and that's where the risk management for collections comes in. And in fall of 2019, as a springboarding off of the training that we did last fall, we're now going to be doing a train the trainers for the risk management for collections approach within our agency. And we've renamed it, because risk management for collections sounds like it's just about the stuff in the buildings. But collections is supposed to be taken much more holistically within cultural heritage, and buildings, landscapes, all those things are considered collections. So we've switched it to value-based decision-making for cultural organizations. So it springboards, it ties in with emergency and disaster planning, but it's a much broader scope for making decisions with the valuable materials that we have. So, thank you. We'll take questions, or I'll be around at lunchtime if anybody has any more questions about that fabulous leaf casting machine. But again, thank you for sending us to the Netherlands.
Question?
Michelle, you didn't mention, at least I don't think you mentioned, nor did Cordell, the New Netherlands Institute and Charlie Daring's program at State Archives with all the Dutch records. That must be the elephant in the room when it comes to Dutch records in New York State. Are they also benefiting from this sort of new programming, new conservation work?
The conservation work is still really new, but I did have them signed, and Charlie knew about those documents that we had in Senate House, but they were outside of his interpretive focus. So, but he helped us for getting them translated, because not that many people speak Dutch anymore. Sorry. But yeah, they're one of our partners. They come to our events. There's a lot of exchange going on between the two of us. But for conservation, this is still really new. Nobody in North America has this technology.
And if I could add, Charlie Steve, the current director, and Yanni Venema all attended the summit meeting. They actually Steve started talking to me probably about a month ago about doing a joint lecture series with the Netherlands Institute and Parks. So they've definitely we've been in touch with them, and we've been working with them.
Oh yeah, they're part.
That's great.
Yeah, they're definitely part of everything that we're working on.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Wynn. All right, picking back up with National Register reviews.
Yes, let's resume the agenda.
Let's do that.
Michelle Cordell, thank you very much.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks. That's a wonderful presentation. What a wonderful program. The next item up is the Sag Harbor Hills Historic District, and Jennifer Betzworth.
I think I can officially say good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
And welcome to the second round of National Register presentations. So I'm really excited to bring this one to all of you today. The Sag Harbor Hills, Azurest, and Nineveh Beach Subdivisions Historic District, also known as SANS, is significant under Criterion A in the areas of community planning and development, social history, and ethnic history as a summer community created by and for people of color and their families. The district reflects the work of its founders to create the community and develop strategies for its success, the value of the social networks established by the African American professionals who purchased land and built homes there, and the aspirations that they held for their families. Just to give you a little bit of context, Sag Harbor, the village, is right here. So we're just to the east of that. Eastvale, a community of people of color, formed on the eastern side of Sag Harbor starting in the 1830s. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, this year-round community, centered around the St. David AME Zion Church, welcomed summer vacationers of color. Eastvale served as an anchor community for these families, attracting them to the area and ultimately helping to inspire the creation of the Sands subdivisions. And so Eastvale, again, is right here, just again to give you a little bit more of that geographical context. Sands was developed shortly after World War II on sandy land east of Eastvale as a summer resort for people of color who wished to enjoy leisure time along the Sag Harbor waterfront. Sisters Maud Terry and Amaza Lee Meredith spearheaded the creation of the Azurest subdivision in 1947. The planning and settling of Azurest paved the way for the planning and settlement of the Sag Harbor Beach Club, Sag Harbor Hills, and Nineveh Beach subdivisions, which were owned, platted, filed, and sold in phases by white developers. Although the Sag Harbor Hills and Nineveh Beach subdivisions were not initially planned by or for African American homebuyers, the growing presence of people of color in Azurest, combined with racist assumptions of profitability, laid the groundwork for them to become de facto African American communities. Middle and upper class African American professionals saw this as an opportunity for access to protected beaches, safety from the oppressive conditions of Jim Crow, and the ability economically to own a vacation home for their families. And these are some examples of some of the earlier, smaller homes in the community. Housing segregation, discriminatory urban planning and zoning, and mortgage financing policies prohibited many people of color from building or buying housing, let alone developing and enjoying resort housing. Creative solutions were required to make Sands accessible even to middle-class African Americans. Terry and Meredith established the Azurest Syndicate in 1950 during the second phase of the Azurest subdivision to facilitate sales of lots, offer small mortgages to buyers, and act as a property owners association. This building here is Terry Cottage, which one of the earliest buildings in the community, actually designed by Amaza Lee Meredith and built in 1949. She was an architect, and she was also the founder of Virginia State University's art department. In the Sag Harbor Hills and Nineveh Beach neighborhoods, families typically paid cash for the land and were able to obtain credit from local hardware stores or contractors for the material for their homes. Some owners built progressively with the help of friends and neighbors, and some made arrangements with local contractors. Each of the three neighborhoods grew gradually over approximately a 30-year period as new families became members of the seasonal community. Each owner was responsible for building his or her own home, so the neighborhoods lack a cohesive design identity. But as owners generally built in popular modern styles, Sands really does have a consistent mid-20th century modern aesthetic. And these are some examples of ranch homes which began to appear in that early period around the same time as some of those smaller homes are coming in. Oops, there we go. The Sands community is among a small number of surviving beach communities in the United States with African American roots. These communities allowed African American families a welcoming environment to enjoy summertime amenities that they could not enjoy elsewhere due to racism and exclusion under Jim Crow laws. African American families learned about the opportunity to become part of a tight-knit summer community in Sag Harbor through family connections and extensive social networks based on their educational and professional associations. These neighborhoods became and continue to exist as havens for middle-class and upper-middle-class African American families populated by doctors and lawyers, artists and academics. And I hope all of you who are on the board were able to glance through the appendix at the end of the nomination. It really does read, the residents read like a who's who, and the guests to the community range from Duke Ellington and Lena Horne to Congressman Adam Powell and Lieutenant Governor Basil Patterson, and then on and into the more current era. The Sands beaches were and continue to be a place of congregation for Sands residents and visitors, and a setting for social connections as well as intellectual conversation and civil rights planning. While many of the homes in Sands are more typical examples of mid-20th century urban design, some families hired architects, built homes based on plans or magazines, or were inspired by more playful trends in mid-century residential design. Though again, smaller homes still remained pretty popular. Really, the goal isn't about the home you're building here, it's about becoming part of this community and having access to these beaches and having a safe place to go for the summer. As the subdivisions grew, the community's summer traditions formalized. Many centered around women and children who spent entire summers in Sands while fathers and husbands worked during the week. Residents fondly recall the fish fries, barbecues, and beach parties they experienced during their youth. Parties were given on rotation, and it wasn't uncommon for families to cross subdivision lines to attend. Community-wide events such as the annual Kids Parade and Labor Day weekend events were and remain very popular. Families in the neighborhood welcomed each other into their homes, looked after each other's children, and shared parenting. And I've heard that through many of the letters and calls that I've gotten. There were a lot of people watching out for you. You better not get in trouble. Residents often refer to Sands as a safe haven where they felt comfortable, safe, and free from racial attack and embarrassment. The community continued to thrive into the second half of the 20th century. As the neighborhoods matured, residents of Sands experienced and participated in new residential growth, landscape changes, and physical improvements. The roads, which were private and laid out within each of the subdivision plans, were originally unpaved. Because of the dirt roads, homes in Sands lacked certain amenities that were available in comparable contemporaneous subdivisions sold to white homebuyers elsewhere on Long Island. Although Sands homes had well water, the unpaved roads meant that there were no fire hydrants, which in turn made insurance rates very high. In 1977, the community self-funded its connection to municipal water. Around the same time, the roads were paved in all of the neighborhoods. In Azarest and Sag Harbor Hills, the roads are public and publicly maintained. Nineveh Beach still self-funds the maintenance of their roads and maintains private control. These improvements during the late 1970s marked the beginning of change in the neighborhoods, which have gradually transitioned to have more year-round residents and have seen generational and larger cultural changes in recent decades. However, Sands remains one of the last thriving and primarily African-American-owned resort beach areas in the country and retains a strong summer community presence that includes descendants of the original families. So the draft you've all seen was spectacular, done by, the consultant was Allison McGovern of VHB, with the contributions of Georgette Greer-Key and many others within the community. There was a lot of oral history done. We have a lot of letters of support, so let me take a deep breath here. We have letters from Congressman Thomas Suozzi, former Congressman Charles Rangel, State Senator Kenneth P. Laval, Assemblyman Fred Thiele, NAACP New York State Conference, the Board of Trustees of the Village of Sag Harbor, the Eastvale Community Historical Society of Sag Harbor, Dr. Andrew Carl, who's a scholar whose research focuses on 20th century African-American beaches and resorts, Renee Simons, the president of the Sands Neighborhood Association, 8 property owners and 4 supporters, including one from the former president and CEO of the National Urban League. We do have letters of objection from 5 property owners. And we do have a visitor here today to speak on behalf of the nomination. May I introduce Georgette Kruky, the executive director of the Eastvale Historical Society.
Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to be here today. I'd have to say that I stand here today very humble and very emotional at the same time, because I can't believe that I'm actually here today. Deputy Commissioner, members of the board, and to the staff here, especially Julian, and to many of you in this room, and especially to Jennifer, and to two Jennifers, and to many of the people in this room that I have called on several times throughout this process, because not just this property, but many of the properties on Long Island and properties associated with African Americans on Long Island that have been under attack. It's been, to me, a process to make sure that I can see myself and my ancestors in the built environment on Long Island. Because it's one thing to have evidence in paper, but to have evidence in a built environment is equally important. And the more and more that they disappear, the more and more I feel our story will disappear. So I stand here flattened and humbled, grateful that I have the opportunity to speak to you today, and also grateful that our story is not subjugated just to slavery. Yes, that is a part of our story, but the story of civil rights, the story of ownership, the story of contributing to the greater fabric of American history is also equally important. The story of us as a people that have strived against all odds and that are still here surviving, working, and becoming a part of the American dream that we've always fought to be a part of is equally important. In these homes that you see, the 301, but now 190 of contributing, and the gratitude of the community residents that worked so hard for this, and the greater community of Sag Harbor that have all come together to work for this one common goal, just like the National Museum, and the greatness of everyone participating to tell this great American story has really humbled me. And that's why I traveled all the way here to be here today, because I could not have this moment go past without witnessing and being able to carry this back to my community for generations to come. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and I thank you for this time.
Questions from the board?
I just want to say it's a really wonderful nomination. It was absolutely really well detailed, excellent to read. So happy to have this before us. Which also makes me astonished that there's any objections. So as I typically ask, why are people objecting to this? Is it a common, is it a typical?
No, I've received so many letters of support.
Yeah.
I think there's some people who are concerned that a local district could come down the road. But you know, with any community, it's also, when you're tight knit, you also have that like Uncle Joe who has complaints about everything. So I think there's a little bit of that, but it's really not. There's been so much support. I was telling Georgette, you know, you always hope when you're working with a historic district that you have a really good sponsor who's getting out there and talking to everyone. And I've never worked with a better sponsor than the Sands Neighborhood Association. They've made efforts from the very beginning to try to make sure everyone was in the loop and everyone understood, and to reach out and really explain what their goals were here to honor the history of the neighborhood. And you can never get them all.
Yeah, no, that's excellent, and the thoroughness and the detail that's in the nomination is that's great.
Anyone else? Could you say a brief word about criterion consideration G and the period of significance?
So with the community here, we have the period of significance going to 1977. And the reason for that was really pretty clear as we were looking at it. So the 50-year cutoff right now, it would be 1969. So we were just extending a little bit into that period. And we need to draw that end of the period of significance somewhere that makes sense. And as we looked at the broader history of the community, it really did say to us that the paving of these roads and the bringing in of water was the sort of beginning of changes that would come later, with newer people coming in, the beginning of later generational changes from that first generation starting in the 50s. And it made it easier for anyone to get into the community. The reason they didn't pave the roads for so long was in part to help keep people away that they didn't want to be there. And so as the things widen, things change a little bit, and it just seemed very obvious looking at it that pushing that period a little bit made the most sense.
Yeah, well said.
I just say this is a wonderful, moving story, a marvelously put together nomination, enlightening in every respect, and it couldn't have been better stated than by our visitor, and coming a great distance and speaking with real emotion. I think this is really close to the heights of what we do here. Terrific.
Daniel.
Wint, if I can echo you in that, I think this is, I just think this is further proof of the continuing diversification of the National Register list in New York State, of the efforts and commitment by staff to seek out, embrace, support, encourage these types of nominations. This is where we want the National Register program to go, not just in New York, but nationally, and I'm glad that staff here is so committed to that goal, so thank you for that. And Georgette, it is so nice to see this come across the finish line. This is a proud moment for all of us, both sides of this one.
Thank you, Daniel. Any other questions or comments? Kristen Herron, seconded by Paul. All in favor?
Aye.
Unanimous. Thank you.
All right, so we're jumping to Brooklyn for a different kind of story. Alku, New Beginning, and Alku Toinen, Second Beginning, the buildings constructed by the Finnish Home Building Association in 1916 and 17, respectively, are significant under criterion A in the area of social history as the first purpose-built true cooperative apartment buildings to be constructed in New York State. Built by and for Finnish laborers, the buildings operated based on the Rochdale Principles established in 1844. These principles, which include democratic control, a nonprofit structure, voluntary membership with individual economic participation, and concern for community, set the foundation for the operation of cooperatives internationally and remain at the core of the cooperative movement. New York City's Finnish community grew in the late 19th century as the result of troubles in Finland, including crop failures, rural poverty, and political tensions created by the Russian Empire. New York's largest Finn towns were located in Harlem, in Manhattan, Sunset Park in Brooklyn, and in the Bronx. Finnish immigrants brought a deep familiarity with the cooperative movement with them. Finland's cooperative movement was one of the strongest in the West and grew over the course of the 20th century. By 1914, the majority of the Finnish population was involved in some form of cooperation. In America, Finns used cooperative organizations to help maintain their cultural identity, distribute Finnish products, and contribute to the community's success. In response to the housing crisis in New York City, the lack of housing that met their needs, and the discrimination they faced as new immigrants, a group of working-class Finnish builders established the Finnish Home Building Association to work cooperatively to build suitable and affordable housing for their community. Each family in the cooperative contributed funds and skills to the project and were together responsible for repaying loans to community members and a cooperative bank. The buildings are also significant under Criterion C for architecture, though they're pretty modest examples of apartment buildings themselves. Alku was designed by Maxwell Cantor and Boris Dorfman, and Alku Toinen was designed by Eric O. Holmgren. All three men were first or second generation Eastern European immigrants, were members of the Brooklyn Society of Architects and American Institute of Architects, and worked prolifically in Brooklyn. Both buildings feature simple neoclassical revival-style facades that relied on cost-efficient details and a predominant use of brickwork, which lent itself to the skills of the Finnish builders involved in the project. The functionality, efficiency, and livability of the interior was of utmost importance. Each floor was divided into 4 units, which offered the luxury of larger, light-filled spaces and well-designed interior circulation with wide corridors. So it's not super easy to see, but we have a central hall here, and then each of these L's is an apartment. Alku and Alku Toinen were lauded by national cooperative publications, gained state and local notice, and were immediately filled and appreciated by members of the Finnish community in Sunset Park. While Finns were familiar with cooperative ownership, the project was groundbreaking in New York State and was initially slowed by municipal authorities that found the idea of joint ownership strange. As most other previously existing cooperatives were food-based, the State Department of Agriculture regulated all cooperatives, including housing cooperatives, for decades. And on this, it's one of the agriculture's publications in 1920, and we have the Finnish Building Association's buildings here alongside 21 other cooperative organizations, the only ones being housing. The buildings maintained a stable community that was committed to following community rules and bylaws based on cooperative principles. Each apartment owner had 1 vote in matters related to the operation of their building, attended regular monthly meetings, and were responsible for paying a small monthly maintenance fee. Apartment rates remained stable throughout the period of significance, not beginning to rise in response to market rates until later in the 20th century. So just to take you a little bit here on the inside, this is the entrance for Alku. And here's the hallway. So there's some more decorative details in these public spaces, but the rooms themselves are very simple. So following the model established by the Finnish Home Building Association's ownership structure and building design philosophy, other groups of Finns established their own cooperatives. These spread rapidly within the Finnish enclaves of Sunset Park and the Bronx through circa 1930. Alku and ultimately those were established, about 30 of them, Finnish cooperatives, in existing and purpose-built apartment buildings. Many continued to operate after World War II, when the nonprofit housing cooperative became the favored method of housing in New York City. And here's some interior spaces that retain some earlier details. Alku and Alku Toinen were an immediate success, contributed to Finnish social and cultural cohesiveness, and demonstrate the accomplishments of immigrants working together toward a common goal. While the population of the apartments remained stable, the demographic of the cooperative ownership of the buildings was no longer predominantly Finnish by about circa 1955. While the cooperative's documentation changed to English during this period, its founding rules and principles were retained, and both buildings remain under cooperative ownership and operation today. So the draft that you all saw was prepared by Valerie Landersina, who's a co-op resident, and Cecilia Fea, I believe, assistant professor at Marymount Manhattan College. And we've got a lot of letters of support that I could not totally read because they were partially or all in Finnish. But we did get one from the Amerikan Uutiset, which is the national newspaper for Finnish Americans, the New York Metropolitan and Florida chapters of the Finlandia Foundation, the Finland Center Foundation, the Sibelius Breidablik Lodge, the Finnish American Lawyers Association, the Richmond Hill Historical Society, and the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission.
Oh, nice. Questions and comments from the board?
Why hasn't this been nominated as for national significance? I mean, is it truly the first co-op apartments in the country? I mean, that's
Yeah, we
pretty
did.
amazing.
We had the proof for the statewide significance. To be able to confirm that there was national significance would have taken a bit more context and research, which may well be worth doing. And we noted in the nomination that that is a distinct possibility. But that's another level of research and digging that probably is worth
Do I
doing,
hear water?
but it was quite a bit to get to where we were.
So, once it's nominated as state, do nominations ever go to the national level as a second
It could
step?
absolutely be amended and be brought to a national level of significance. I know that the co-op is interested in using homeowner tax credits, and so there's definitely some interest in okay, let's get this moving now that we've got all the pieces together. And they haven't expressed a super strong level of interest in reaching for that national level.
1917? 1916, 17?
It's fairly easy to add a level of significance to a nomination. It doesn't have to come back to the board. You can simply write up an essay that puts it in a national context and send that in to the Park Service, and they will accept it or not and say, okay, we'll raise this to national level. But you have to, for national significance, you have to put it in the context for the whole nation.
Sure.
And with something like this too, where it's a first, sometimes it's hard to prove that something was a first because you're proving absence. So that makes it a little bit more challenging, where with New York we had very clear evidence that this was a first in New York.
You can also add another level of significance. You could add significance in another area of, like you could add archaeology to a nomination later if you had the documentation, and just send in additional pages to support that.
Don't try to sweet talk me.
We wouldn't do that without Doug. The only thing you have to bring something back to the board for is if you're increasing or decreasing a boundary. But you can always add an additional level of significance, additional area of significance.
Great. Thank you. Other questions, comments? Motion? Chuck? A second? Kristen? All in favor? Aye.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, right.
My apologies.
Well, do we still have seven now?
Seven is.
We have seven.
Seven's okay.
We have
All right.
seven, okay.
As long as we're
Thank
good.
you, Michael.
Someone's watching out for us. All right, so moving a little bit further north to the East Harlem Historic District, which is significant under criterion C in the area of architecture for its extensive intact groupings of late 19th century row houses and flats and late 19th and early 20th century tenement buildings, as well as religious and institutional buildings designed by notable architects. It's additionally significant under criterion A in the areas of social and ethnic history for its association with the Jewish, Italian, and Puerto Rican working class immigrant communities that occupied the neighborhood successively from the mid-19th to the mid-20th centuries and beyond. While many other ethnic and cultural groups have been associated with the neighborhood, these three stand out for their length of stay, percentage of the population, and for having lent their names to the area over different periods of time. The name East Harlem has been used informally to cover a large area, and while the history of immigrant communities played out throughout the whole of East Harlem, much of that history revolved around the commercial spine of East 116th Street here, from Park Avenue to the East River, and along the residential spine of Pleasant Avenue, over on this side of the district, and on nearby blocks. The district's period of significance, 1865 to 1966, covers a century of the neighborhood's historical and architectural evolution and its post-Civil War development as an immigrant community. The buildings of the historic district predominantly consist of row houses and flats dating from the 1870s and 1880s, and tenements dating from the 1880s to the 19-teens, along with a number of commercial, institutional, and religious structures. The row house is a distinctive element of the residential development of mid to late 19th century New York City in general. And like row houses elsewhere in the city, the East Harlem examples create uniform streetscapes with a distinctly New York flavor. As the city grew denser, 4-story French flats, multiple dwellings with 1 apartment per floor, joined the row houses and were often designed in similar styles. The tenements in the district, including both old law and new law types, reflect the evolution of housing reform in the late 19th and early 20th century in New York City. Like the tenements of the Lower East Side, with which they are roughly contemporary, the East Harlem tenements were the first home for waves of immigrants during the country's period of vast immigration in the decades before and after 1900. Jewish settlement extended throughout the city and throughout East Harlem, but only this section became known as Jewish Harlem. German Jews began settling in the area during the 1860s and were later joined by Eastern European Jews. The number of Jewish families in East Harlem grew into the mid-1920s when it comprised half of the neighborhood's population. Italian-American communities have existed in all 5 boroughs, but East Harlem became known as Little Italy, rivaling the area of Lower Manhattan, also known by that name. Italians began moving to East Harlem during the late 1870s and remained a significant part of the neighborhood's ethnic and cultural makeup into the 1960s. Religious life, community, and tradition was central to the Italian population. Our Lady of Mount Carmel, which you see here on the left, was served a varied Catholic population, but became strongly associated with a culturally Italian annual feast and parade in honor of the Madonna, which continued into the 21st century. During the first quarter of the 20th century, 2 banks were established on East 116th Street to cater to the Italian population. The construction of these 2 buildings reflects East Harlem's solidification both as a major Italian-American neighborhood and as a community that even conservative bankers found to be a good investment. These banks facilitated the transfer of funds back to Italy and offered the comfort of Italian-speaking staff with knowledge of the community's needs. Fiorello LaGuardia, who first served as a congressman from East Harlem, helped bring new public projects to the neighborhood, many funded with WPA money during his tenure. These included the WPA Pool and Play Center designed by Amar Embry II in Thomas Jefferson Park, the modern classic New York City Health Center, said to be the first city-built and owned health center in Manhattan, and the first in a series of similar buildings planned for the city, and the Georgian Revival Benjamin Franklin High School, an experimental school modeled on East Harlem-based Leonard Covello's educational theories. LaGuardia's protege, Vito Marcantonio, a progressive, fiery, and controversial figure, served as East Harlem's congressman from 1934 to 1950. LaGuardia established the intersection of East 116th Street and Lexington Avenue as his lucky corner for campaigning, and Marcantonio continued the use of this corner for speeches and events. It was in 2017 they put this little road sign of the Marcantonio Lucky Corner. So we're still very proud of that history, and that's 1943 speech there. Spanish Harlem, or El Barrio, is most closely associated with the Puerto Rican experience in New York City. The earliest Puerto Rican immigrants arrived in East Harlem during the 1920s, and the population grew substantially by the 1950s and continued to grow through the end of the 20th century. The post-war years saw little construction in the district, all of which was related to the flourishing of Catholic institutions and the growth of the community. This is one of those later builds. It's a neo-formalist New York City public school completed in 1962. While change has begun to come to the area, the district retains the buildings that so many communities have called home and continues in its role as a neighborhood of entry for new immigrant groups. So the draft was prepared by consultant Tony Robbins, and we have letters of support from the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission, Historic Districts Council, and 2 property owners who are very excited. We have received letters of objection from 60 property owners out of a total of 639 owners within the district, so about 10%. And to any questions about that, I think there's still, even though I've talked to many people, there's some confusion between the National Register, local historic districts, by Landmarks Preservation Commission, and some people get very scared, which isn't unreasonable. So we do have a visitor on behalf of the nomination today, Chris Cirillo from Landmark East Harlem, the sponsor of the district. If you'd like to speak on behalf.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to just say a few words. So I'm representing Landmark East Harlem here today. My day job is I'm the executive director of Ascendant Neighborhood Development Corporation. We've existed in East Harlem for 31 years, and we preserve and develop affordable housing in the community. And Landmark East Harlem came together about 4 years ago as the neighborhood was gearing up for a major planning and rezoning effort. So our organization and several other local organizations and individuals and residents came together to start working toward preserving what's left of the built fabric of the neighborhood. As you saw from the map that Jennifer showed earlier, a lot of redevelopment has happened in East Harlem over the years, public housing redevelopment, urban renewal, and certainly new market rate development has been increasing as the market has grown in Manhattan. And with the new rezoning that went through at the city level in late 2017 and the second phase of the 2nd Avenue subway about to come to East Harlem, we wanted to make sure that this sort of central hub, this central node of the neighborhood centered around 116th Street and Pleasant Avenue had the protections of being on the National Register, and also to allow for especially local small homeowners to have access to the homeowner tax credit. So that's all I really wanted to say. I'm not nearly as eloquent as Georgette, so it's really, she's a tough act to follow, but I do want to thank everyone at the State Historic Preservation Office who worked on this, and especially Jennifer, who came down and did an amazing job at our property owner information session and really helped to address a lot of the concerns that people had about the implications of listing, and also got a lot of people really excited about being able to access the tax credits to preserve their properties. So thank you very much.
Questions from the board?
I'd just like to say that my daughter and her family occupy one of the buildings in the proposed district.
Did they object?
And I'm pleased to say that it's a contributing building, and I feel that because they merely rent, that I would not have to recuse myself. And I'm prepared to move this wonderful Upper Manhattan district.
Motion to approve by Wint. Second? Jennifer Lemack. All in favor?
Aye.
We have 8. Thank you, Jennifer. That was great.
Bill Crenter.
Next up is Winged Foot. Sorry. Bill Crattinger is going to take us to the golf course.
My first ever.
Wicked.
There was a lot of learning involved.
And for what?
Oh, I jumped forward. Yes, I'm going to present the Winged Foot Golf Club in Mamaroneck in Westchester County. After my presentation, I'd like to introduce Penelope Watson, who prepared the documentation, to say a few words, and also wish to note that Michael Lynch is intimately familiar with the clubhouse, given work he fielded while in private practice. Okay. Winged Foot Golf Club consists of 2 18-hole golf courses designed by renowned golf course architect Albert Warren Tillinghast, and a Jacobean Revival-style clubhouse, a commodious stone and brick masonry building with slate roof that combines the visual allure of an English Tudor manor house with a crisp and efficient plan designed by noteworthy golf course architect Clifford Wendehack. And those were Penny's eloquent words. I've stolen them. The undulating topography of the 2 courses constitute a designed landscape dating from the golden age of golf course architecture, a period which both Tillinghast and Wendehack contributed significantly to. Although the 2 courses, referred to as the East and West courses, and we'll look at those in a moment, evolved over time in response to changing technology and the evolving nature of the game, both have undergone meticulous restoration under the guidance of golf course architect Gil Hance to restore them as closely as feasible to the original Tillinghast design, using available archival resources and state-of-the-art laser scanning and computer analysis. And I will add at the end as well that we had a significant discussion with the National Park Service regarding this restoration work and what it meant to the integrity of the course. The two restored courses, which rank among Tillinghast's most memorable designs, along with the Wendehack-designed clubhouse, today constitute a historic resource of considerable importance to the history of golfing in the United States, and that actually might be an understatement. We see Ben Hogan in 1959 in the left historic images, a view of the course looking back on the top, of course, towards the clubhouse west elevation, and of course the recognizable winged foot emblem. Here are our two principals in the story. On the left, A.W. Tillinghast in an early aerial view of the courses. You might say Tillinghast cast about in life for a while until finding his purpose, which was singularly golf. Everything about golf, whether playing golf, designing golf courses, and it really emerges in the 20s in this period as the preeminent golf course architect and designer. He's also somewhat of a tragic figure because with the onset of the Depression, interest in golf course design and constructing new courses began to obviously flag. He served an important role for the PGA, basically as an ambassador to the PGA to keep the organization intact. And he really died almost in obscurity, basically running an antiques business in which he was selling his own household possessions. So that's Tillinghast sort of in a nutshell. Clifford Wendehack on the right, along with his perspective view of the clubhouse, really the acknowledged sort of leader in golf clubhouse design. I know this is a somewhat narrow focus area, but in 1929 he published a volume which really became sort of the definitive work on the subject, and also in the mid-20s contributed to the White Pine architectural series, which we all know very well, in an article on early Dutch houses in New Jersey. View, again, historic view, looking back towards the rambling doesn't quite capture it. The Tillinghast courses were completed and opened to members in 1923, and the clubhouse was completed in 1925. Winged Foot Golf Club's debut on the national scene occurred in 1929 when the United States Open Championship, or what we know as the US Open typically, was awarded to Winged Foot's West Course. This date is identified as the terminal date for the period of significance, given the tournament was in its essence an affirmation of the importance and quality of the design. The club was founded by members of the New York Athletic Club, which eventually settled on a 280-acre parcel of land in the Mamaroneck area, which had actually been slated for a housing development. A couple views of the building, very difficult, as you can see, to capture sort of in its entirety. Michael in particular wanted me to point out the 1980s edition in the bottom left, which, while using a compatible material, deviates somewhat, let us say, from the historic scheme. Tillinghast, who in 1922 was just finishing overseeing the layout of two courses at Baltusrol Golf Club in New Jersey, Springfield, was then among really the most sought-after course architects. Wendehack, the nation's leading architect of clubhouses, was commissioned the same year to design the new club's building, which was built in 3 planned phases. Although the courses have been modified over the ensuing years due to the evolution of the game and other circumstances, they both have been meticulously restored to reflect the original design intent. Underhands. Winged Foot Golf Club remains an important touchstone to American golf's golden age and 2 of its foremost design practitioners, Tillinghast and Wendehack. It is being nominated in association with criteria A and C at the national significance level in the areas of architecture, landscape architecture, and recreation. The cited period of significance focuses on the original mid-20s work of Tillinghast and Wendehack, and also the 1929 Open, which is really the terminal date which affirmed the importance of this design. And it really is a place where you just walk through the halls and look at the things on the wall alone, and it is really, few places could be as steeped in the history of American golf as Winged Foot. I have not played. My father-in-law has played and played Baltusrol and Bethpage Black, He gave his vote of confidence, for what it's worth. Contrasting historic view of the lobby and lounge with a contemporary view. The grill on the left, the main circulation access on the right. And finally, just a word about the courses themselves and their significance. Really, Tillinghast, he was an innovator in a number of ways. First of all, he liked to work with the existing landscape and topography where possible. But really, one of the major innovations was this paradigm shift from what was called the penal course type, where really you were afforded basically one shot at the hole, to what's called the strategic course, which is sort of a risk and reward system where you may opt to do a dangerous shot, and if you're successful, you're going to play the hole much better. So it was a major paradigm shift in terms of the design of the courses themselves. We have a nice letter of support from Stephen Otis of the New York State Assembly. And Penny, I wonder, would you like to say a few words as you are the golf course expert?
I'm very happy to be here today on behalf of Wingfoot as their consultant to see this nomination being presented. Wingfoot management is very aware of their history. They have a lot of displays throughout the clubhouse. They are hoping to pursue National Historic Landmark status by the time of their centenary, which is, I think they've decided on 2023 for that, since construction took about 5 or 6 years. There are only 3 golf clubs in the country that combine a Tillinghast course with a Windaheck clubhouse, and of the 3, this is the one that is the most intact and significant. So I'm, again, thank you very much for hearing the nomination.
I want to note we had an extensive conversation with Jim Gabbert, Kath, myself, and Michael Lynch, in which we broached the topic of the idea that the course had evolved. It's obviously it's a designed natural landscape, but there have been significant changes by other golf course practitioners. Jones, for instance, that work was reversed to bring it back to the original phase, for the most part, to really more sort of accurately depict what the original Tillinghast course was. It was, to his mind, not a major issue so far as integrity, and he really gave his sanction to this as a nationally significant resource, given these 2 major players, from the 20s, from the golden age of course design. So we did vet it with the Park Service as well.
How many courses have been nominated or placed on the National Register of New York? Shinnecock Hills, I think, was, and Bethpage.
Bethpage. Travis did one in central New York, and there have been some in districts. Like I know the Glimmerglass district has a few in it, but I can't answer your question without going to our database. But in looking for some, I couldn't. I know Travis did one. I know Bethpage.
Shelter Island.
Which one?
Shelter Island.
Okay. And I know Glimmerglass had a couple around the lake.
But Shinnecock Hills, that was one of the earliest. I remember pushing it with the people who were very resistant.
Maybe that one too.
So maybe they
we
continued
were
to resist.
looking for other ones by Tillinghast, and the only other one was Bethpage. I know that Robert Trent Jones did some in our state parks. In the central region, he did 4, but they haven't been listed yet. But we had a great conversation with Jim Gabbert, who gave us a lot of perspective on restoring golf courses.
I actually had I think it's a suggestion. Because the design landscape is so critical to obviously, to the nomination, and each hole is detailed really nicely in the narrative with the quotes from Tillinghast, sorry.
Yeah, they're all named.
But then when I got to the visuals, I really wanted to be able to link them up, and
We've left you underwhelmed, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. So that's my suggestion.
We're still working on our final photo set.
Fantastic. So I encourage you to make that more obvious to the
Expansive.
reader. Thank you.
Do you know if the restoration was concerned with things about the type of plant species that were used and going back to original grasses?
Yeah, that's
and things?
interesting. I never read through the strategic plan. Do you know that?
I would suspect not, because I think the conditions for golf have changed so that I think now you can get a PhD in golf grass.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, turf.
Other questions? Do I have a motion? Erica moves, second. Chris, all in favor? A reluctant eye from Winter, wow.
Not based on another nation.
Certainly not.
I know what it's based on.
We're good.
Thank you.
All set?
Yeah, we're all set, Bill.
Thanks, Penny.
Hawkins Row?
Yeah, we've decided a slight renaming to the Jacob and Caroline Hawkins House, as opposed. We didn't know a lot about the Row period, and they were very late in the game, mid-30s onwards. But in any event, the Hawkins House. Jacob and Caroline Hawkins House is a substantially intact example of Greek Revival-style rural domestic architecture located in the Campbell Hall area of Orange County. Erected circa 1839, for the Hawkins family, the dwelling is a timber frame construct consisting of a commodious two-story main block and an attached story-and-a-half L with an accessible grade basement. Although not a temple front example of the style, the house nevertheless features a robust Greek Revival-style decorative program, which on the exterior consists of two formal entrances with corresponding pilasters and entablatures, windows with fully articulated classical surrounds, a wraparound porch sustained by fluted Grecian Doric columns, and deep friezes with corresponding cornice returns. Inside, the main block retains its original side hall, double parlor floor plan, and most all of its historic plaster, wood, and marble finishes. And I just want to note at this point that really it's somewhat rare to walk into a house, especially in a prosperous agricultural area like Orange County, where I've seen many farmhouses and they evolve over every generation. There's a new addition and there's a new stylistic feature. This house remained remarkably pure to the original building campaign. Really, there were no updatings, nothing added, nothing changed. So it is really, in terms of interpreting a period artifact, it really is wonderful. It's currently owned and maintained by the Orange County Historical Society as a rental property. The house was erected for Jacob Mills Hawkins and his second wife, Carolyn Decker Hawkins, and it remained in the family's possessions until being sold in the 1930s. Although in some regards conceived along conventional lines, it nevertheless exhibits spatial and finish features which directly relate it to the Greek Revival, which was then approaching the height of its popularity as a national architectural style, really the style. The house remains remarkably pure to the original late 1830s building campaign and its construction by the Hawkins family. It is being nominated in association with National Register Criterion C in the area of architecture as a highly intact and excellent representative example of the Greek Revival style as expressed in a rural Orange County farmhouse. So here we see the main hallway, we see all the principal decorative features, wall pilasters, deep friezes, paneling under windows, the staircase is intact. And then really the double parlor, I mean, this could be a row house in an urban area. I mean, it really is pretty high end for a farmhouse, if you will, with all sort of the decorative bells and whistles characteristic of the Greek Revival style. But I think of this floor plan, the side hall, two-room deep parlor as being so essential to this period and the Greek Revival style. And very deep plaster cornices and gray marble mantelpieces, but really a wonderful and pretty pure example of a Greek Revival farmhouse.
You had access to attic and basement areas where you saw both hand-hewn and sawn.
Yeah.
Is
Yes.
that been common
It is common. What's happening at that time is they're hewing sort of the larger members like top plates and principal girders, and a lot of the smaller components, rafters, studding, floor joists are being sawn by that time. And it's probably economics. It's easier to hew out a long top plate than to have it milled, so it's as much probably an economic consideration and availability. When you see that, there's clear evidence, usually in the form of empty mortises or the way that timbers have been scarfed together. It's actually very common. It wasn't the case in this house, where they salvage everything they can from an earlier building if possible. Okay.
Questions? Motion? Hello. Wint first. Lucy had her hand up first for the second. All in favor?
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Bill. Let's break for lunch. What do you say? We'll meet back here at 1:30. That was merciful, right?
Just to reiterate, my territory is the Finger Lakes and Onondaga County, and I have 2 items for your consideration. The first is the former Waterloo High School in Waterloo and Seneca County. The Waterloo High School was built in 1928 and is being nominated under Criterion A in the area of education for the role it played in promoting progressive education, largely through the efforts of its principal, Charles R. Foley. And a discussion of progressive education is in the nomination, so I won't go into all the details, but if I had to define it in 25 words or less, it's basically everything that we take for granted in education today, and that it would be student-centered experiential learning that included vocational classes, home economics, arts, music, field trips, PTAs, and elementary school kindergartens. That's 26 words, but who's counting? The building is also being nominated under Criterion C in the area of education. Sorry, not education. That's what I have in my notes here. That's architecture. As an excellent example of early 20th century neoclassic architecture. And it was designed by Rochester architect Carl Ade, who specialized in school design. The lower image is Ade's rendering for the school that appeared in the local newspaper. His design for the building was that of a quote-unquote temple of learning that emphasized its neoclassic design and detailing, which included pillars, urns, pilasters, swags, pediments, Palladian windows, and inspirational inscriptions. Early 20th century American neoclassic architecture, civic architecture, had its roots in the City Beautiful movement, which sought to reinforce the principles of democracy in its citizens through city planning and architecture. Following the upheaval of World War I, neoclassicism was recognized as a reassuring symbol of stability and reflective of American democracy in the architecture of Thomas Jefferson. Okay. And I have a note to myself here that we had a previous nomination and listing of his, and that was the Watkins Glen High School, which we got listed in 25. That's another design by Carl Ade, and there are a lot of similarities with them. Here we have a panel on the gymnasium wing. It's one of those inspirational quotes, and also the date of construction in Roman numerals, which I guess would be very educational for kids. Other quotations were over the main entrance, primary auditorium door, and north door to the gymnasium that is now partly obscured by a portico and an ADA-compliant ramp. Here's a better view of the gymnasium wing. Physical education was a component of progressive education. In 1938, the high school hosted a PTA meeting where Florence Kenfield, the physical education teacher, addressed the parents on the meaning and value of play. This was part of a larger Finger Lakes Parent-Teacher Association conference with over 100 participants, all converging on the Waterloo High School. And undoubtedly, many of the sessions were held in the auditorium. The auditorium wing at the south end of the building had a separate entrance facing onto West Main Street, allowing this part of the building to be used for community events and after-hours programs. The curved bay contained a smaller meeting area. Let me point that out for you here. There's the curved bay. Okay. The limited decoration and windows in the west end of the wing indicate the location of the stage. Around 1962, the building became the junior high school after a new high school was constructed, and eventually it became an elementary school. It was continually used until recently, which accounts for its good condition and retaining much of its original interior fabric. You can see some modifications such as newer windows and drop ceilings, but the original ceilings are still extant. The sponsor of the nomination is the school district, and they are in the process of selling the building in hopes for tax credits. There is a person who is interested in purchasing the building, and they have filed a Part 1, which got its approval recently. We have a letter of support from the village for this project, for this listing.
The new ceilings and windows are part of the 1973 renovation?
Probably, yeah.
Overseen by a grad of the school?
Yeah.
That's a nice addition. Yeah, it's a great form. Other questions? I'll move this one. Somebody want a second? Chuck? All in favor?
Thank you. Okay.
Wheaton Schumacher?
Next, we go on to Onondaga County. This house, this is the Wheaton Schumacher house. It may have a slightly different name on your list. We've changed it to reflect its two important periods of ownership. Okay. The house was built in 1892. Oh, I forgot to mention it's in Syracuse, as you can see, Onondaga County. Okay. Built in 1892, it was at the far east end of West Onondaga Street, which at that time was Syracuse's quote-unquote Grand Avenue, and is therefore being listed under Criterion A in the area of social history. And if you're not familiar with Grand Avenues, let me just say that the house was originally part of the lifestyles of the rich and famous who located on West Onondaga Street, and in this case, the wealthy person was Dr. George Wheaton. He was a successful physician, but hit it right a couple of times in the real estate field, allowing him to move from a house further west on the street to 366 West Onondaga Street, where he had this one built. It's also being nominated in the area of commerce, also Criterion A, has represented the early 20th century professionalization of the funeral industry as it became the Schumacher Funeral Home in 1921, hence the name change that we gave it. This is all explained in the nomination document, and the house is also being listed under Criterion C in architecture, primarily for being a design of prominent Syracuse architect Archimedes Russell. The upper left shows the hall from the main entrance portico with its decorated ceiling and terracotta fireplace at the far end. To the right is the tower room, and the lower left is the dining room in the west tower. The image to its right is a detailed view of the painting between the windows and the crown molding that's in the dining room. The house was designed in the Queen Anne style, and towers seem to be a common characteristic of Russell's work. And for those of you, we've had a few of his other buildings being nominated. If you remember the St. Anthony convent complex that had the huge towers, the rounded, and yeah, when you look at this house, you go, oh yeah, Archimedes Russell, definitely. A previous owner was doing work on the building and removed some interior features, but these are stored for future restoration and replacement. What we're looking at here is the second floor. The layout of the rooms is very much the same as when Russell designed it, but the Schumachers made some modification in 1921 when they turned it with the second floor into their private living quarters. The main hall became their living room, which is seen in the upper left. The west tower room was shortened by the addition of, well, we can't really figure out, we're calling it closet space. They also added a hallway. In the lower right is the corner tower that was enclosed when a bathroom was added off the hall and a sitting room added to its west. The slide in the lower right shows that some parts of the attic were finished at one time. And what we're looking at here is the coffin lift. I should probably kill some more lights so you can see it easier. The coffin lift in the first floor west side of the house that brought up the bodies from the basement after embalming in preparation for viewing. The house was recently acquired by the Syracuse Land Bank with the intent of finding a new owner to use federal tax credits to rehabilitate the building. This was also a previously missed example of Russell's residential work, which is hard to believe because the man designed over 800 buildings, and around half of them were residences. And this one was probably overlooked because it's kind of tucked between apartment buildings and other commercial development at this end of the street. So kudos to the land bank for finding this building. Are there questions?
Do you want to alter the lighting so we can see that better? Maybe just if we could turn off one of these banks? Oh, that's great. That makes a big difference.
I'll just point it out to you. Here's the attachment for the coffin. The floor would go down. This door's in the way. There's a little door right here, which is where they would push the coffin through.
Mm-hmm. So interior architectural pieces were put in storage for restoration?
Yeah.
What's going on there? How come? I mean, that's a great idea. Why did they do that?
I'm not sure, and I should have asked the land bank about it, but I think the previous owner was starting to do some work and may have gotten over his head.
Mm-hmm.
But the good thing he did was, when he took the pieces, the molding, the staircase, those pieces, he put them in various rooms. Most of the pieces are in that little weird room that we can't figure out was a closet or whatever.
So they're on site?
Yeah, it's on site.
Oh.
And I included that closet area with the pieces in it.
Okay.
It's in your draft. Yeah.
In the social history section about and a description of Syracuse, Syracuse is described as a web of swamps that would otherwise have been ignored if not for the salt deposits at the one end of the lake. I just love that.
Said the Buffalonian.
Said the Buffalonian. Forgive me. Showing my Western bias.
You know, after your 10th nomination that you're reading about the salt deposits, I'm like, oh, here we go again. Yeah, right. Okay. Salt
Questions, comments? Would anyone like to move? Erica? Not to Syracuse.
You want a low salt diet?
Ouch. I'll second, since I was so rude. All in favor? Aye. Thank you.
I just want to note that we are developing a more active relationship with the land bank in Syracuse, and I just appreciate the fact that they are consulting. You know, they know how to consult and reach out to this agency and staff, both on the National Register, the survey, and the tax credit unit. So this will be a productive relationship. This is a good report back to them that we support their agenda and how they're anticipating treating historic resources in the city.
I guess it's a shame this video will be available online. All right, next up is Buffalo Public School 51, Jennifer Walkowski.
All right, continuing our exploration of Buffalo Public Schools. This one's a little different. Buffalo Public School 51 is significant under criterion C in the area of architecture as an example of a school building that encompasses two periods of school development and construction in Buffalo. It's really pretty apparent. The late 19th century was a period of tremendous population growth in Buffalo due to the industrialization of the city, which spurred the construction of many new school buildings. Similarly, the early 20th century was an era of tremendous school construction and development in Buffalo, implementing new concepts of modern school designs, including standardization. Built in two stages, the first in 1894-1895, and the second in 1927-28, PS 51 notably incorporates one of the only remaining intact examples of a 19th century school building remaining in Buffalo. Most of them were demolished and replaced by modern schools. So the fact that this integrates really one of the early examples of Buffalo schools is pretty notable here. Mm-hmm. So the original portion was designed by William W. Johnson, and it's characterized by its Renaissance Revival style exterior and has a simple double-loaded corridor interior plan typical of the 19th century. So this is the older portion here, and then the 1927 portion over here. So the addition to the building was designed by Ernest Crimmy, the head architect for the City of Buffalo Board of Education, and embodies a collegiate Tudor Revival style exterior and an interior plan that reflects standardized school planning and requirements of the 1920s. Each of the two portions of PS 51 retains a high level of architectural integrity in terms of plan, elevation, and materials, which convey the different values emphasized through school design during these two eras. Both of these architects designed the school based on concepts and plans that were commonly accepted during their time, which were subsequently adapted to suit the individual context of the school. While hygienic concerns were emphasized as a priority in school designs of the late 1890s, concerns for fire safety, prevention, and egress began to dominate school design by the 1920s. This later portion embodies these concepts seen in the presence of double-loaded corridors, cloakrooms within classrooms, and a large gymnasium and auditorium. Together, these two portions convey an understanding of the modern school as it evolved between the late 19th and early 20th centuries. PS 51 is associated with a significant historic context of school design philosophy at these two different major periods of educational design. Reflecting both the Renaissance Revival and Tudor Revival styles, the school building maintains a high degree of integrity in plan, materials, and design. Here's a few views of the interior. I just want to note that this really interesting brickwork is in the older portion of the building with this kind of probably not modern wood staircase. And the brick actually continues in most of the classrooms in the older portion. And then in the newer portion, the 1920s portion, you have, typical rooms that you would find in a school of that era, big assembly spaces, auditoriums, gymnasiums for health and recreation. So this is Buffalo Public School 51. Are there any questions on this?
How does it relate to a multiple property listing?
It's located in the Black Rock neighborhood, which has a multiple property documentation form that covers historic resources within that area. So it falls under public architecture, and it meets the registration requirements under that multiple property documentation form.
So is it being nominated under that or individually?
It's nominated individually, but that provides additional context about the development of Black Rock, the neighborhood, resources, the development of the neighborhood as a whole.
Thank you. Other questions? Would someone like to move? Oh, that was pretty close. I'm going to say Wint was the first and Chuck was the second.
Okay.
All in favor? Aye.
So here we
Seneca
have
Plumbing and Heating.
The Seneca Plumbing
I
and
know this
Heating
one.
Company building is significant under Criterion A in the area of commerce for its association with the Seneca Plumbing and Heating Company, an important immigrant-founded, family-owned commercial enterprise which was able to thrive on the once prominent commercial street of Seneca Street in the early to mid-20th century. The building is also notable in the area of social history for its ownership and operation, ownership and operation reflect the growth and success of Buffalo's immigrant, specifically Jewish population. Seneca Plumbing was founded, owned, and managed by Max Linsky, a Jewish Russian immigrant, and its history of success embodies the notion of the American dream. The building was initially constructed around 1896 as a light manufacturing warehouse building with retail storefronts, but it best reflects the era during which it was owned and occupied by Linsky's Plumbing Company. Although multiple businesses occupied the building in its first few decades, the design, plan, and materials of the building do not have sufficient integrity to convey its early history or its significance as a late 19th century retail and manufacturing space. However, it does retain enough key features to represent its significance as the headquarters of the Seneca Plumbing and Heating Company between 1937 until 1969. This is actually a circa 1937 photo that shows the Seneca Plumbing Company in one of the storefronts. Linsky arrived in Buffalo in 1922 when his family worked in the neighborhood in a variety of low-wage jobs. Lacking a formal education, Linsky grew his plumbing company from a small operation located in a rented garage into a large, thriving operation that, at its height, operated out of 3 entire floors of a building that he owned. After a fire damaged the building in 1932, causing the removal of a 4th floor, Linsky was able to purchase the building in 1937, and his shop occupied one of the storefronts. By the following year, his Seneca Plumbing Company occupied the entire building. Linsky's company continued after his retirement in 1975 under a second generation of family ownership. By this time, many changes occurred in the surrounding area of Seneca Street, and much of the surrounding neighborhood fabric was abandoned as retail activity shifted away from Seneca Street, but the company and building it occupied survived as a fragment of a once densely populated, vibrant street. The period of significance for this project begins in 1937 when the Seneca Plumbing and Heating Company purchased and occupied the building, and ends in 1969, which aligned with broader changes in settlement patterns that largely made other commercial activity on Seneca Street obsolete. While they reduced their use of the building, using the upper floors as warehousing space and focusing their retailing on the ground floor, Seneca Plumbing and Heating Company continued to operate out of the building until relocating in 2011. While this area of Seneca Street remains largely vacant due to urban renewal activities during the late 20th century, there have been some new developments in the area which have spurred the rehabilitation and reuse of the underutilized building. To the east, the revitalization of the old hydraulics neighborhood into Larkinville has helped bring new attention and vitality to this section of Buffalo, just east of downtown. Immediately to the building south, the expansion of the Buffalo Transportation Piercero Museum has also brought new momentum to Seneca Street. The reuse and rehabilitation of the former Seneca Plumbing building into commercial space and apartments contributes to the rebounding of this area of the city. I just want to note that this project is actually wrapping up, as you might be able to tell. It does have an approved Part 1. So this is the Seneca Plumbing and Heating Company building. Are there any questions on this?
Questions about Seneca? I'm good with this. Would anyone like to make a motion? Paul? Erica seconds. All in favor? Aye. Thank you, Jennifer.
Oops. Oh, sorry. There's some interiors. Ah.
Is that why it says the botanist? Yeah. She didn't mention that. So what is it now?
It's being rehabilitated for use as a marijuana dispensary.
Alrighty then.
We've had a lot of breweries and distilleries.
Hey, whoa. No, I meant that it was a common local landmark that I've driven by many times.
Oh, you said you knew it well.
I bought washers there in 2011, I swear.
Moving to a different subject, the First Presbyterian Church of Lewiston.
Perhaps I could be reformed.
The First Presbyterian Church of Lewiston and the Lewiston Village Cemetery are adjacent, individually significant resources that each have strong associations with the settlement and development of the village of Lewiston. While the two resources developed independently, the two resources have shared a symbiotic visual landscape association since the community's earliest era. So the Lewiston Village Cemetery is significant under Criterion A in the area of exploration settlement as the primary burial ground for the village of Lewiston from the settlement era until the mid-20th century. With nearly 2,500 interments spanning almost 2 centuries, Lewiston Village Cemetery provides valuable information about the area's early history and serves as a resting place for almost all of the settlement era families, for numerous individuals who were involved in the development of the town, for many prominent persons and community leaders from later generations, and for military veterans from 6 wars, including the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, and the World Wars of I and II. Lewiston began to develop in the late 1780s when settlers started to travel west from New England into New York State's frontier region. The village of Lewiston developed along the eastern side of the Niagara River and served as a main point of entry to the United States from Canada in the early 1800s. The town's first burial ground was established near this river crossing in the early 1800s on land later acquired by the village, and the earliest burial of record was Betsy Clark in 1802. By 1812, when the burial ground came under the stewardship of the village of Lewiston, there were 13 burials of record. During the next century, the cemetery expanded to the south, with new sections laid out in 1879 and 1951. Today, the 2.5-acre cemetery features an intact collection of funerary art from throughout this long development era. As the primary burial ground for the village, Lewiston Village Cemetery provides information about the origins, intermarriages, ethnicities, and religious affiliations of its citizens as a record of the village of Lewiston. The First Presbyterian Church of Lewiston is significant under Criterion A in the area of social history as the oldest religious building in the village of Lewiston and for its long and close association with the history and development of the village. Soon after the Lewiston Village Cemetery was created, a group of settlers formed a religious society under the leadership of Reverend Miles Squire, a missionary from Buffalo. The Reverend Squire's religious society developed into the current Presbyterian congregation, and in 1826, the group organized a building committee to build a place of worship. The First Presbyterian Church is also significant under Criterion C in the area of architecture as a representative example of a typical Greek Revival style meeting house in the Wren Gibbs tradition that was updated and expanded numerous times over more than a century, embodying different eras of church architecture to meet the changing needs of its congregation as it evolved from a pioneer era church building to a modern 20th century facility. The original portion of the church was constructed in several stages between 1830 and 1844 and generally reflects the Wren Gibbs church type. Built of stone with stucco covering, this section of the First Presbyterian Church features many hallmarks of the type, including the pronounced pediment front entry portico, centrally located tower on a front gabled building, and a large open auditorium-style worship space. Late 19th century changes include the addition of stained glass windows and other interior decorative changes. However, the general form and spatial divisions of the mid-19th century church generally survive. This is the interior of the old portion, and then this is the new wing that was added. So the first large addition was added in 1953, which added a chancel and parish hall. Although wood frame rather than stone, the building was of similar size and form, and its exterior was covered in stucco to match the older church. The final addition was a large mid-century sanctuary and ancillary spaces added in 1965. This addition stylistically complements the earlier portion of the church with the integration and interplay of classical motifs in both the historic and modern sections, and demonstrates the continuity almost there, of classical style within a modern context. At that time, the interior of the original section of the church was updated in a complementary colonial revival style aesthetic. So I just want to note that this project has received letters of support from the local Historic Preservation Commission, as well as from the mayor of Lewiston. So this is the First Presbyterian Church of Lewiston and the Lewiston Village Cemetery. Are there any questions on this?
Questions from the board? We've reviewed the form and had a nice presentation. Would anyone like to make a motion? Lucy? Oh,
Who was the second? Was it
I think-
Kristen? Hiding there?
all in favor? Any opposed?
Thank you.
Abstained? Great. Alrighty. On to the George Washington Hotel.
All right, I'm back. Hopefully I didn't hit all my home runs this morning. So this is the George Washington Hotel, which is significant under Criterion C for its Italian Renaissance Revival design, and as an example of one of the final apartment hotels constructed in New York City after the building boom of the 1920s and before the passage of the multiple dwelling law of 1929, when apartment hotel construction came to a near halt. The hotel is also significant under Criterion A for its association with the history of housing and social history in New York City. Completed in 1930, the George Washington Hotel was designed by Frank M. Andrews and John B. Peterkin for the Club Hotels Corporation. Designed to give a sense of social sophistication to its clientele, the architects utilized the Italian Renaissance Revival style and employed a monumental entrance, elaborate terracotta decorative details, and grand interior spaces furnished with luxurious materials. Apartment hotels like the George Washington catered to the city's growing population seeking moderately priced housing in convenient locations near businesses, shopping, and amusements. The success of the building type was a result of its relative affordability and the offering of the amenities of a hotel with the greater permanence more typical of apartments. The George Washington Hotel, born of a great need, as its brochure advertised, offered such a place for emerging young professionals of discriminating tastes just beginning their careers in the city. The hotel distinguished itself with its club-like setting, offering extensive amenities and comforts that had been previously reserved for the upper class. In addition to the 630 modest-sized rooms, residents could take advantage of the entire second floor, which was designated as communal space for residents and their guests. This included a large Italian Renaissance Revival gallery that overlooked Lexington Avenue, and here it is today. a colonial revival style lounge, a Georgian revival style library, and smaller reception and bridge rooms. And this is a tax credit project, and it's quite clear they've taken great care in preserving and maintaining those spaces. While the George Washington's eclectic combination of exterior and interior spaces referred to opulent styles of the past, it clearly offered amenities and accommodations that were distinctly modern. So we do have an approved Part 1 on this one. The draft was by Lindsay Peterson of Higgins and Quaysbarth, and we have a letter of support from New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission.
Can you remind me why the period of significance is from 1930 to 1935 only?
So that it goes from the completion of the hotel through the end of the ownership of the original period of owners. I believe that decision was related to when it was really being operated under this like serious presidential hotel corporation. That sort of concept sort of falls apart by that 1935 period, and it's still a sort of an apartment hotel after that, but it does change a bit.
It does remain a pretty cool hotel with a great bar that a lot of people went to.
Yeah. Well, and I know the former library is now an excellent bar, I've been told. I've looked at it online in pictures. I have not visited myself, and I understand that others of us are very familiar with this place. So.
I work a couple blocks from it, and I can't speak to the bar, unfortunately. But from the Arts Council perspective, what's so cool about the Freehand, its current name, is that the rooms have artwork commissioned by Bard students and alumni, and they have an artist residency now. So this is the second year of having 4 artists in residency at the current mission. So
the rooms are really cool. And
Yeah.
I don't know, Jen didn't put a picture in, but like I wanted
You
to
have
move
them in your nomination.
And Michael has a wonderful story, which I don't know if he wants to tell.
He's hiding behind the post as he's saying that.
I don't need to tell him.
Maybe privately you can ask him.
Yeah, now we're way more curious than we were. Other questions? Substantive questions? Do I hear a motion? Wint? Second? Kristen? All in favor? Aye.
And we have, Lucy's not here, so.
But we have 7.
Just so we have 7.
They're in the
Thank you.
ballpark. St. Luke's Hospital?
Moving on, St. Luke's. So St. Luke's Hospital in Morningside Heights is significant under criterion C in the area of architecture as an early and important work of American architect Ernest Flagg that reflects developments in the architectural design of hospitals. It is also significant under criterion A in the area of medicine as a good example of an urban hospital demonstrating the evolving role of hospitals in providing medical care in New York City in the 19th and 20th centuries. Early hospitals, which often had a compact plan, had to contend with the spread of illness between patients. By the mid-19th century, pavilion plans, which prioritized through ventilation and typically featured low-slung pavilions separated by large areas of open space, had come into favor. Flagg made advances in the pavilion plan, adapting it for the urban landscape. He positioned the pavilions close to each other but kept them isolated by fresh air cutoffs. These relatively tall pavilions stacked more floors than earlier pavilion hospitals while maintaining standards of ventilation and protection against contagion. They were differentiated by function, representing the various treatment, scientific, administrative, housing, and other aspects of the increasingly complex modern hospital. The hospital also represented a departure from the red brick Romanesque revival style that had dominated institutional architecture in New York City in the later 19th century. The French Renaissance revival style of the St. Luke's pavilions, derived from palatial 17th century Parisian models, gave the array of pavilions a unified design expression despite their complex differentiation in program and plan, and was a milestone in the introduction of Beaux-Arts style institutional architecture to New York. And these, I just had to show you these balconies. This is sort of the far end of the building overlooking Morningside Park. And this pavilion plant, it was designed for private patients. So they had something a little nicer at their pavilion. The period of significance for St. Luke spans from the completion of the first flag-designed buildings in 1896 until the last historic addition constructed in 1965. Flag's 12-building master plan for the new St. Luke's campus continued to serve the hospital's needs and was followed into the mid-20th century. And you can see here, the numbers might be a little small, but we have the evolution of the campus sort of through that period. So you can get a sense of how it's changed, and we'll jump back and forth from buildings to aerials so you can continue to see that. 5 buildings and 2 smaller buildings were constructed during the initial campaign. 3 more were built over the next 30 years. The other thing to note about this that made this project maybe a little more unusual, and maybe it's a little bit more of an arcane National Register thing that you may not be aware of, is that because of the design of the hospital, where all of these buildings were interconnected historically and continue to be, this is counted as one building, which caused different complications for this as a tax credit project. But if any interconnection during the period of significance effectively under the National Register regulations causes it to be caused as one building instead of 2. So even all of these later additions into the mid-20th century sort of become part of that. Inside baseball. The expansive forward-looking plan reflected the increasingly central role of hospitals in providing comprehensive, scientifically sophisticated medical services to an urban population. It provided for the advantageous siting of patient wards and a chapel, as well as the modern structures necessary for a hospital's expanding functions. This included housing for nursing staff, laboratory and surgical facilities, administrative and physicians' offices, and private patient and outpatient pavilions. The thing I'm sort of pointing out here, this funny little building, it's a stable, and it remains as a bit of a maintenance shop, sort of tucked there in the middle. And it's pretty delightful there on its own. The other one was lost, so it's good that we have it. Following World War II, the hospital desperately needed to add new capacity and facilities. Instead of following Flag's plan, they instead chose a new modern design focused on efficient, simple, modern facades and interiors. So this is about circa 1955, when the Clark building is put in. The hospital was also able to abandon the pavilion plan as a result of the introduction of antibiotics, which eroded the link between the physical arrangement of spaces and the treatment of illness. After the introduction of air conditioning and ultraviolet light as a disinfectant, natural light and outdoor air was no longer perceived as necessary in a hospital environment. And here's sort of a full aerial. You see the plant buildings here and the more modern buildings on that side. The additions constructed in the later 20th century were not built with any consideration to Flag's plan or to the style or scale or materials of the Flag buildings, but they do represent important later trends in healthcare planning as well as the substantial post-war expansion of the hospital. This period saw a sharp rise in hospital admissions, aided by the adoption of antibiotics and the creation of employer health insurance plans that made hospital care more affordable. The hospital constructed 4 large pavilions from 1954 to 1971, which accommodated the 1952 merger with another major Morningside Heights institution, Women's Hospital. So we'll go inside just a little bit. This is the main entrance of the administration building, which until those 20th century additions was the primary entrance into the hospital. And looking straight ahead here is the chapel, which is quite lovely. It was inspired by 19th century French ecclesiastical architecture with a large stained glass window by English artist Henry Holiday. And there are some spaces in the pavilions that still have some of their more finer historical details. This is a reception room. But in general, what you see is what you'd expect in a hospital, things getting changed over time, corridors, simple finishes, easy to clean. And that's St. Luke's. So we do have an approved Part 1 application on this one. The draft was by Jonathan Taylor of Higgins and Quaysbarth, and we have a letter of support from New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission.
Great. Questions from the board? Do I hear a motion? Lucy? Paul? is the second. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed or abstained? Good.
I wonder what's gonna happen to the memorial tablets inside. I hope that there'll be a requirement that they be retained or made
Only
available to people.
the tax credit project is only 2 of the pavilions that are being
It's 4
turned
of
to
the
residents,
pavilions.
not the whole hospital.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting tax credit project. The hospital's no longer using 4 of those pavilions, and so they drew a line through their property and sold it off. And I believe they've constructed some interior partitions now.
Yeah.
But the rest of the building is still being used as a hospital. So the developer has had to work collaboratively with the hospital, bring them along with, and make sure that they're okay with this whole project.
The rest will remain a hospital.
Yeah.
So the plaques are in the entrance hall in Muhlenberg, which is in the center of the old hospital.
That's still owned by the hospital.
It is, okay.
Jen, can you show the 2 that are being?
The
for
4.
4, but one of her slides shows it really well. These are gonna be residences?
So these 4 are the focus of the tax credit project.
Right.
From Muhlenberg on is still hospital. All this is still hospital. So. And I believe they're gonna use the ambulance stable as some sort of community building. I'm not privy to all the details, and I'm sure they're constantly changing. So.
It's already in. We voted.
All right, one last one here.
Now we're discussing.
Yeah, we've been working on this for a really long time.
St. Luke's, yeah.
Stanley H. Lounge
St.
House.
Luke's has been around for a while, so it's good to see it coming to an end. So this is the Stanley H. Lowndes House, which was built in 1895. It's locally significant under Criterion B in the areas of maritime history and commerce for its association with Stanley Lowndes, a prominent regional figure and renowned oyster baron. The house is additionally significant under Criterion C as a notable local example of Queen Anne architecture. The oyster industry was one of the most important economic generators of growth for the village of Northport and had a significant impact on its development. Born in Connecticut, Lowndes learned about the industry at an early age from his grandfather and father, who pioneered and developed oyster culturing in the region. As natural oyster supplies diminished, they discovered that oyster growth could be enhanced and controlled by placing hard, smooth surfaces in the water near existing oyster beds. They also became involved in planting oysters, the process of catching or cultivating oyster seed and then depositing it in a specific location. These new processes and the associated infrastructure presented new legal problems. To ensure their investment, growers needed to maintain control over the water bottoms where they were culturing oysters. And this map is from the 40s, so a later period, but it gives you a sense of how Connecticut approached this, really subdividing little bits of the water bottom to different oyster growers. So you had ownership over where you were planting your oysters.
So those aren't house lots, those are.
This is underwater.
Ocean bottom oyster beds.
Yeah.
Neat.
It's a pretty astonishing map.
It is.
So following in his family's business, Lowndes developed significant cultured and seeded oyster beds, and when he encountered resistance due to state and municipal regulations, became involved in litigation. As he pushed his operations further into Long Island Sound, Lowndes became embroiled in a legal case to claim rights as a non-resident to harvest oysters in the waters claimed by the town of Huntington. After nearly a decade of appeals, in 1894, the Supreme Court of the United States made a final judgment in the case. The court sided with Huntington, which claimed that its colonial patents, which included harbors, gave it the right to restrict underwater harvesting rights to its residents. After this final decision, Lowndes relocated his primary home and the headquarters of the Lowndes Oyster Company to Northport to be able to take advantage of the excellent conditions for oystering in the Northport harbor. From Northport, Lowndes continued to expand the company into one of the most successful oyster industry operations in the region during the period. The company operated several processing and shipping facilities, including one in the harbor next to Lowndes' home. And this is the only one of those outbuildings you saw in the last photograph that still remain. It's used as more of a boathouse now, but it's great that there is some remnant of that industrial landscape that's still there. After he made the decision to move, Lowndes announced his entry into Northport's business and social communities by commissioning local builder Darius B. Ruland to build an expansive Queen Anne home to overlook his oyster operations. The house reflects the style through its asymmetrical massing, horizontal and irregular silhouette, sweeping wraparound porch, waterfront rear-facing tower, and diverse use of materials. The house exemplifies the motif through, on the interior as well, through its remarkable and intricate woodwork present throughout the building, which has been attributed to the carpentry expertise of its builder. And it's great, the owner has these photographs. Looking at the calendar, they all date to 1903, so these very original interiors still throughout the house to just give you a taste of that. There's a little bit of a taste for 19th century furnishings and design as well, but that's its own thing. Our obligatory cat photo in our presentations, I've done that for you today. And this is in the tower room, and I love that they have the original radiators that curve around the sides of the tower. And then on up into the attic, this would have been servant spaces, retains all of its woodwork as well. And that is the lounge house. This was a Columbia draft, which took a few iterations. And we do have a letter of support from Stephen King, not the Stephen King, but Stephen King, the Northport Village historian.
Great. Any questions for Jennifer about this nomination? Do I hear a motion? Kristen and Jennifer. Jennifer's second. All in favor?
Thank you.
Abstain or oppose? Good. All right. Camp Hill, Pomona.
Okay, I'm back for round two. As you have probably discerned from your nomination packages, the next two buildings are related. They're related historically as representations of the district school system in the town of Ramapo as it entered towards the end in the early 20th century. And they're also related because both have been rehabbed by the village of Pomona for contemporary use. And we'll start with the Camp Hill School. Located in the village of Pomona, the Camp Hill School was dedicated in 1923 and served as the schoolhouse for Ramapo's District Number 12 from the time of its completion until its discontinuation due to local school centralization. The nominated building has, since the late 1970s, functioned as Pomona's Village Hall and as a public gathering space for residents, and it is presently one of two historical educational buildings that have been sensitively repurposed under the village's auspices. Erected as a two-room schoolhouse, it is a one-story building of load-bearing masonry construction with cross-gabled roof, smooth stucco-finished walls, a slate shingle roof, and modest detailing of a classically inspired nature. Large banks of windows admitted light to the two classrooms from the east and west, and these remain along with their original multi-pane wood sash. The school was built to the designs of the architectural office of Ross and McNeil, with Ramapo resident Robert E. Chamberlain serving as an associate architect. Although the former school was modified for contemporary use in more recent times by the village, it retains many aspects of its original school period form and layout, including the two upper story classrooms in the basement assembly area. The Camp Hill School remains an important historic resource and one that shares direct associations with the history of education in the town of Ramapo. The building functioned faithfully as a school until the 50s, at which time the area's school districts were centralized. As you probably see from reading the context, it was a pretty heated discussion about whether the schools, in terms of advocating for centralization, it was a debate that went on for some time. Probably not unusual for most areas. After laying unused for a period, it was renovated in the later 1970s to function as a municipal office and as a place for residents of Pomona to gather. And the village actually is a pretty short history. It only formed in 1967 from lands formerly contained within the towns of Ramapo and Haverstraw, in part as a measure to block development, interestingly enough. And I want to say I've been familiar with these buildings for some time in Pomona, and they take significant pride in both of them. Although a building of modest proportions and decorative treatments, its design nevertheless embodies design principles associated with standardized practices developed in the early years of the 20th century in New York State. It's being nominated in association with Criterion A in the area of education, given its direct association with education in the town of Ramapo, and in the area of architecture, as a somewhat typical and intact example of an early 20th century two-room schoolhouse. And that is the Camp Hill School, or the District Number 11 School.
Is its significance derived in any way from proximity to Burgess Meredith?
No, and actually I'm very well familiar with the Burgess Meredith property, and that's how actually I first got to know this. But no, there's no significance cited in that for that association.
No penguin sightings? Okay. Other questions? I'll move. Anyone want a second? Lucy, all in favor? Aye.
Great.
Now to the Riddler.
Finally, moving on to the other school, the Pig Knoll School, as it was commonly known, or the District Number 11 School. It's an interesting story, a tragic tale in some ways, but a building, with a pretty significant architectural pedigree that served but a brief period as a school before being revamped, basically as a civic building, again for the local residents. Pig Knoll School was built as a District Number 11 school in 1915. It was built to the designs of Walter Robb Wilder and is characterized by its rustic arts and crafts stonework and interpenetrating hipped and gable-roofed masses. The principal elevation is symmetrically composed and dominated by a large central window band that corresponds with the former classroom within. And in the narrative, I think we discussed how both the massing and the materials, Wilder really successfully produced a design that was really in keeping with its immediate setting. It's a building that's really well integrated with its site in that part of Rockland County. The building's period of usage as a school was relatively short-lived, consisting of less than 15 continuous years and excepting a brief period mid-century when it was placed back into service. A second life for the building was assumed in the early 1950s, at which time it was deeded back to the residents of District Number 11 for use as the West Pomona Community Center. After falling into disuse yet again, it was eventually acquired by the village and presently serves as the Village of Pomona Cultural Center, which functions as a gallery and performance space. So this building has really gone through an incredible evolution, first from a schoolhouse to a civic facility that fails. And then in the 1970s, basically a local architect takes an interest and starts residing in the building to protect it from additional vandalism and decay. And then finally it is brought back and reused again as a civic building, and that's been a very successful use. That is Walter Robb Wilder. As we see, a picture from Olympia, Washington, where his firm was responsible for the construction of the Washington State, basically Capitol complex and its principal buildings. And he was a protege of Stanford White as well, and really cut his teeth in the McKim Mead White office as an architectural draftsman. The building's architect was a draftsman, as I said, later worked with Harry Keith White. His wife, Louise Beebe Wilder, an accomplished and renowned gardener and author of numerous books on the subject. The couple resided in Pomona, and they took a very active interest in both the community and its school-aged children. So really the design of the building and his contribution of the design had to do with their investment in the community, and it was his way of giving back. Another view of the building, north end. Continuing 1952, following centralization, building was deeded back. By the early 1980s, it was R. Todd Campbell was the architect who basically took up residency in the building, used it as a residence and a studio at a critical time in its history, and probably is responsible for us having it in the landscape still by investing in the building and staying there. It's being nominated under Criterion A in the area of education for its association with the history of education in the town of Ramapo, and also in the area of social history for its use beginning in '52 as a mixed-use civic space. It's, of course, also being nominated in the area of architecture for its association with Walter Robb Wilder as a one-room rustic schoolhouse design, really towards the tail end of that sort of building type. And that is the Pig Knoll School.
Questions or comments about Pig Knoll School? Do I hear a motion? Wint is first. Second? Erica. All in favor? Aye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Church of St. Gabriel?
Two more.
This is near Donnelly's, right?
Well,
This is near the Donnelly's Ice Cream Place and Gabriel's. And
The last two. And this is one of Emily's that I offered to pick up, and I was able to pull it together really literally over the weekend. I'm sorry, it's not quite perfect, but it's a preservation emergency. And this is the Church of St. Gabriel the Archangel, and we just this morning got a letter of support from the town of Brighton, who actually gave me the street address, the consultant. It's so far up there in the Adirondacks that we could not actually find the address, and neither could the consultant, but we now know that it is located at 12 Church Road. And it was written by Kim Alvarez, who most of you know, and well, I'll just get to it. This is a postcard of the Church of St. Gabriel the Archangel, located in the small resort community of Paul Smiths in Franklin County. And even though this image is in black and white, you can see two important things about the building. First, it had a multicolor paint job. And second, it was always considered a mission church. It never had a full-time resident pastor. And this was typical for many small summer churches in the Adirondacks, which served either summer vacationers or year-round communities that had small populations, or sometimes both. And here's the church today. The small wood frame church was built in 1896, and it was on land donated by famous Adirondack resort owner Paul Smith, and it was apparently built for the Catholic workers at Paul Smith's Hotel who resided in the nearby community. There is no architect of record, and we suspect that it was designed by a local builder, and actually Bill Krattinger was kind enough to help me out the other day. We may have actually identified who that was, but I didn't have it in time to put in the nomination. It's actually a fairly simple building, but it's distinguished by rustic embellishment of all its surfaces, both exterior and interior. On the exterior, it has a sweeping eaves line with deep overhangs, and every surface is covered by a decorative pattern of wood shingle and clapboard. It also has wood trim with delicate sunburst and tassel motifs, which you can see around the door there. It has lost its historic door. The interior relies on a deeply varnished, narrow tongue-and-groove beaded board arranged in a highly decorative manner over every surface. And that is the ceiling and one of the side walls, and that's looking back, and it has a very narrow, only 6 feet wide loft, choir loft, I guess it would be. We think the lights might be later. According to our consultant, these decorative rustic-style churches were more typical of those built for summer guests and contrasted with larger and more traditional brick and stone buildings that were built for regular parishes. That's a little different here because this actually was a summer church, but it had a very small congregation, and so small that it remained a mission for almost its entire history before it became an oratory, which meant that it could only be used for special occasions like a wedding or a funeral, and had no regular clergy. And then in 2012, the diocese finally closed it. And before the diocese closed it, it removed the stained glass windows, which were not original anyway. They had been added in the 1920s. However, it left the church with only storm windows and boarded up openings. However, because there was a clause in the original deed saying that if it was ever used for other than religious purposes, the original landowner could take it back. That is exactly what Paul Smith's College did a few years ago. In order to preserve it, the college took it back for its own preservation. And now that's who hired Kim to do the nomination, and I believe they're seeking grant funds, sacred sites, I believe, and maybe in our program as well. So St. Gabriel's is significant in architecture for its intact rustic style design, and in social history for its association with the small hamlet of Paul Smiths and the community that developed around it. Any, I think I have one more historic photo. Any questions about Church of St. Gabriel's?
Questions from the board? Would anyone like to make a motion? Chuck? Kristen seconds. Are you taking notes up there, Kath? Oh, sorry.
So, Kath, let me ask a quick question. You described this as a preservation emergency. Is there a particular... You described this at the onset as a preservation emergency. I'm wondering...
Only because they need to get it
Gotcha.
Because it doesn't have any windows in it. Those would be the original windows there. See the small panes of colored glass around the large colored glass pane. At some point in the 1920s, and Kim didn't know how, but there are pictures of it with stained glass. And when the Dices closed it, it just came and took all the windows out of it. And so right now it just has boarded up openings. And there are a couple of these, I hope they're gonna put these back in it, because I don't think we'll get the stained glass. But that's the emergency. They need to get it registered for grant funds.
Thank you.
All in favor? Any abstained or opposed? Motion carries.
Sweet little building.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you, Kath. McNaught Family Farm?
Okay, so last, this is my favorite slide in the presentations, even if it is my property. This was prepared by consultant Jessie Ravage. You've seen a lot of examples of her work. This is a 1946 aerial view of the McNaught family farm, and you can just make out our farm in the very center, which is the, this one? There is our farm right there. When the large McNaught family arrived from Scotland in 1817, they leased Lot 82, which was a 202-acre farm, part of the Hardenberg patent, that can still be identified today by most of a massive stone wall. And I can't do it as well as Jessie, but Lot 88 is right about like this. That's about Lot 88. And that entire farm remained in the family until 1962, when Marshall McNaught, the last of the McNaughts, died without any heirs. And in fact, the way that there were about 9 McNaught children and grandchildren, and the way that they spread out, the family owned at one time more than 1,000 acres contiguously across that valley. However, after old Marshall's cows were found wandering around alone one day in 1962, and he was discovered dead in the house, the farm was divided into more than 40 separate parcels, and most of it was sold off and developed. And all we have left with integrity is the 22 acres that is, whoops, wrong thing, right about this triangle. That's what survives, and that's what we're nominating. Now the house consists of multiple parts. The large 2-story section to the right was built about 1865, 1870, during one of the time of great prosperity. The smaller wing to the left was either an earlier house on this site or an earlier house from one of the other McNaught farms that was moved to this site when the 1870 house was built. They have one continuous foundation, but the part on the left has a much older frame. And then the other wing, that's to the left there, is also an older building that is thought to have been moved to the site maybe 30 years later. And so this is the interior of the newer wing, and this is the interior of the earlier wing that was either on this site or moved to the site. Now the outbuildings, which you could see in the first picture, most of them burned, they mostly dated to the 1870s, and most of them burned in the 1980s. The ones that survive, okay, what survives is a 20th century milk house that you see on the right, and the foundation for that milk house, which you see on the left. As you see, it's not on its foundation anymore. A non-contributing shed is on that foundation. That's one thing we have. And then we have, on the left is the foundation of either a horse barn or a carriage shed. And then on the right is the ramp for a dairy barn. Again, they dated from the 1870s period. And then we also have a mill site, which we are not counting because the current owner has pulled some of it apart, like he pulled the mill wheel out, and we feel it needs professional archaeological investigation to be counted, and it needs the criterion, in order to use criterion D, we have to have research questions. And then there are some pieces of stone fencing, that's some of that enormous wall that still survives throughout the property. And I've got to check, I'm not sure that the Park Service is going to let me count those, but we're certainly going to note them in the nomination. One of the interesting things that one of the most interesting things about this nomination for me is that what the consultant turned up about the Scottish immigrants. According to local law, if you read anything about Delaware County, it always says that, and which is full of Scottish immigrants, that they came and chose these remote farmsteads on high elevations because it reminded them of their Scottish homelands. Well, that turns out not to be exactly the case. In fact, they were poor tenant farmers in Scotland, and they became poor tenant farmers in Delaware County, and they were unable to afford the choicer land that was at the lower elevations. And I just want to go back to that, my favorite slide for a second, because the other interesting thing that you can see already in 1946 that is also true today is that by 1946, they were beginning to use machinery. And the land closer to the house, particularly the land in our triangle, had already begun to lose the small field patterns and stone walls that you can see in the larger area over there to the right. And that's because they were taking those stone walls out because you couldn't use machinery and tractors on them. And if you see right here, this is a tractor shed. It's not included in the boundary because since this picture was taken, it was converted into a residence and it doesn't have integrity. But that was already, but the land that we are including, which is basically what's within the triangle, shows that final pattern of farming that Marshall McNaught was using in the 50s and 60s. So the 22-acre parcel that survives reflects that last era of farming. So the McNaught family farm is significant under criteria A and C in architecture, settlement, social history, and agriculture. And this is our boundary, maybe right like that, something like that, 22 acres. Any questions about the McNaught family farm?
Kath, what was the catalyst for this nomination?
An owner who's been pestering me for like 2 years. An owner.
Is there thought about the homeowner tax credit in this?
I've told him about it, but he's done most of the work on it already.
Right, it looks that way.
Do you know how this photo came to be? How did this picture come into existence? I mean, wouldn't it be nice to have this view of all of our nominations?
Well, it certainly would. This is from 1946. It's in his possession. He has another one from the 60s, but you can't see the farm as well. But they had originally wanted to nominate like the whole 1,000 acres.
Uh-huh.
And I was supportive of the effort to nominate the 200 acres if it was still intact. But Jesse went out there and we've had to notify, 40 owners. And she went out there and said, no, it's not intact enough. It's been developed. There are, sheds, hunting cabins, other houses on it, and it's just not enough integrity.
Am I correct that the unevaluated archaeological resources are considered contributing to
No,
it?
they're not.
They're not. They're just
And
mentioned.
I'm not sure that she's going to let us count what we do have, the little fragment of the ramp for the barn and the carriage house foundation either, because we don't have precise documentation of what they were. They show up here, you can kind of see them.
Yeah.
But the last time I counted remains like that, somebody had actually drawn a map in 1912 that showed their dimensions, and I was able to show that exactly what they were and what their dimensions were. This time, we're just kind of guessing, and
Yeah.
I'm not sure that's going to be good enough to count.
Thank you.
Why would the boundary wall or the enclosure wall, freestanding, be objected?
Be what?
Why would the Park Service object to, not a foundation wall, but it's...
Well, no, we can count the boundary wall.
You can, okay.
But
I
we
misunderstood.
can't count the boundary wall around the whole 100 acres.
No, I understand, but
Yeah,
there's a
we can
piece
count
of
the
it there.
wall that survives, yes.
Yeah, that's
That's
a
okay.
wonderful thing. I think that Jesse Ravage did a marvelous job in both family research and making the connection to the lowland clearances in Scotland. I mean, these people, they were driven out of Scotland and they came here, and within a few years, they or their neighbors anyhow were embroiled in more disputes about tenancy and
Yes, and I've read a lot about Delaware County. No one has done that before.
Yeah.
It's really interesting.
Well done. Other questions about McNaught? Motion?
Lucy?
Wint? Lucy seconds? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed or abstained?
Thank you,
Hey,
Ken.
before I just want to compliment all the people who worked on forms today on the maps. The mapping in the historic districts, which I always harp on, was all there. It's awesome. I so appreciate maps of contributing and non-contributing properties when you have something with 600 plus things in it is very, very helpful for us reviewers. So thank you for your attention to that detail. It's much appreciated. The historic districts all had excellent maps. Well, let's talk about this some more.
There was a funny end slide that Virginia had. Did I go? Anyway, well, I'd like to compliment Mike Schifferly for getting them to us so fast. We told them that we absolutely needed them.
Yeah, it's critical for our review, and it's much appreciated. They're excellent. Okay, now, we've gotten through the forms. Daniel, do you want to do your comments now?
Yes.
Deputy Commissioner's report, please.
Thank you. So at the conclusion of today's meeting, you all have approved 17 of 18 nominations. They span 864 resources across 14 communities in 13 counties. So once again, for a quarterly meeting, a big impact across the state, both rural and urban, and I appreciate your work to prepare and to participate, so thank you for that. I'm going to leave the major item for last. I do want to note two things. One, although Eric did not mention it in his report, the Division for Historic Preservation has been authorized for 7 new critical fill hires. And we are very pleased to know that by April we will begin a hiring process that will bring 6 new staff to the division. One of those critical fills is internal. It's someone who's moving from the NHT to our regular funding line. So in effect, 6 new staff will likely be in place certainly by the September meeting. We're happy with that. 2 of those staff will be dedicated to the National Register unit, and so you will begin to meet them in that capacity. May 4th, I Love New York Parks Day. There are going to be volunteer efforts, cleanup, plantings, certainly a range of activities being coordinated across the park system on May 4th. I will actually be up at the Paul Brown or the John. Yeah. Well, I'm sorry to beat you to the punch there, Doug. No, you can distribute. That's fine. I just so I'll be up at John Brown Farm Site for activities and up there, and looking forward to that. What I want to focus your time on, there will be some follow-up from either through me or from staff on this. That there is a significant proposed change to the National Register program in Washington. And this is a direct reflection of the current administration in the White House and at the executive level at NPS. So a proposed rule published in the Federal Register on March 1st would make significant changes to the National Register program, the process for listing certain resources on the National Register, and there's a 60-day comment period now in effect that runs through April 30th. The proposed rule, in the opinion of many, contradicts the intention of both the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 and the 2016 amendments, which are, in the argument of the Park Service, the catalyst for this proposed rulemaking, the 2016 amendments in particular. So, of particular concern to us here is that this proposal would grant federal agencies the ability to block the listing of historic resources on federal lands. And additionally, it would severely restrict the independence of the state preservation offices across the country to make eligibility determinations for resources on federal lands. The impact possibly, it could be argued to be more significant in the western states than eastern. The western states have a much higher percentage of federal lands in play. But it's one that I think this agency needs to be weighing in on. There's an additional concern in the proposed rule changes that nominations, such as we saw, district nominations, such as we saw today, would require the support both from the majority of property owners in a district to both the majority of property owners and the owners of a majority of land area within the district. So large landholders under this proposal would have a weighted impact on the listing, on indicating support for the listing and the determination of majority support or majority opposition. That requirement, the determination of owners of a majority of land area of the property, could be a very burdensome administrative element for us and other state preservation offices. It has not yet even been determined in the proposed federal rules whether we are measuring land ownership by square mile or portion thereof, square feet, cubits. Nothing is yet determined. It will be, these are significant changes, we think not in the spirit of the National Historic Preservation Act, certainly not in the spirit of how the program has operated to date. State Preservation Office staff were on a national conference call with National Park Service senior officials 2 weeks ago for an initial briefing on the proposed rule changes, and NPS administrators got an earful. I want to, Kath was on that call. I don't know who else. I guess Michael perhaps as well. Julian, okay. I just want to credit you both. But Kath, you particularly, please. I was in Washington last week. 30 plus other SHPO offices were part of meetings I participated in. Kath's vigorous questioning and defense of the National Register program were noted and appreciated by several other SHPO offices, as well as staff at the National Trust, the National Council of State Preservation Offices, and others. So I appreciate, I was not able to be on that call for another reason, but I appreciate the reputation we continue to build for rigorous analysis, a rigorous response, and a committed response. So we have informed agency counsel at Parks of this proposed rulemaking. We will be preparing an initial draft assessment. We will share that draft assessment with the State Review Board. We will prepare that draft assessment for distribution to preservation colleagues outside New York State government. I know ironically, although Wayne Goodman and J.D. Lorenzo are not here today, Landmarks Society of Western New York and the Preservation League have key roles to play in making these concerns more public. So we will be preparing, and then from that, we will be preparing a final submittal to the through the federal intake portal, and additionally sharing, because this came up in conversations with congressional offices in Washington, sharing our final opinion with the New York State congressional delegation as well. So that response date falls obviously well between meetings. And again, noting that Jay and Wayne are not here, I'm not sure who best to encourage. But Doug, I certainly will share our documentation with the State Review Board, and you might want to consider the State Review Board providing input to the federal government as well. So thank you.
Daniel, it's just outrageous, absolutely outrageous. What is the chances of litigation to
High.
at least hold it up for, let's say, 20 months?
Right. I consider them high, and other states are already talking about preparing suit. It was referenced by the SHPO office in California in particular. I think they're filing suit against the current administration on a daily basis at this point in time, in one way or another. So I think we will make an effort to be in touch with the Attorney General's office through Kathleen Martens or General Counsel Mincer to at least indicate our concern and prepare them for a potential joining a potential national suit. Julian.
If I can add a comment to Kat's defense, she actually threw some regs back at people and processes that are the way things work, and they actually stunned. They were not either aware of them or were ready for such thoughtful, forceful, and knowledgeable response. Thank you, Kat.
Yeah.
They were saying things like, well, if somebody objects, you can just draw them out of the district. And it says right in the regs, owner objection is not a valid reason to draw a boundary. Oh, okay, well, you should write that in a comment.
I should make.
Maybe tell someone that.
I should make very clear for the record, this is not a rulemaking that comes from line staff in the National Register program at the Park Service. This is coming from senior officials, new senior officials in the Department of Interior. And it is, I think, largely responsive to mining and gas interests in the western states who have been hamstrung or inhibited by
More questions?
so.
Please.
Daniel,
Marie?
Does the Department of Interior control how many of our funds?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, right. So I think they're going to be taking names like, okay, what state objected to this?
Right.
How much money have they given?
Right.
Are we at any risk of retaliation, of reduced funds?
Well, I think the certainly my impression from the meeting in Washington where 36 state preservation offices were participating, all were concerned. There was no blue-red distinction between the level of concern that was being expressed. The National Council of State Preservation Officers is really looking for 100% response rate on this issue from the state preservation offices, which are the 50 states as well as U.S. territories, both in the Caribbean and in the Pacific. I think there is widespread concern. It should not be a surprise that in the executive Trump in the White House's budget proposal, our funding levels, our funding allocation nationally and then specific to New York would drop to 1996 funding levels. So we have been making, we would basically have our federal budget slashed by over 50%. Unrelated to any response to this proposal, we're already at 50% of current funding. So
Thanks. No, just gotta have the
you
facts.
asked me to cheer you up, and I did.
We can't do anything if we don't know the facts. Thank you very, very much.
But we're going to fight the fight regardless. So.
Not to mention how long it would take to compute the acreage of all the people who object and figure out if they owned more than 50%,
right.
For example.
Right.
Yeah, we had 10%.
Well, like, did you notice the map that Jennifer showed of those oyster beds?
Mm-hmm.
Well, what if we were including, now what if we're including that underwater land?
And a single landowner who happens to have a large parcel objecting could have pretty profound effects on the
Yeah,
process.
like one owner could own 100 acres.
That's
and
right.
Other 100 owners
Yeah,
could
doing
own
it by
quarter-acre parcels, and that owner would be able to stop it because he or she owned the most land.
Thank you, Daniel.
Sure.
In terms of board business, I think we should do a couple more housekeeping things and try to get out of here by 3. Mainly meeting locations.
Yes, you.
So I understand
gonna talk about that.
Bob Mackay wants us to come to Planting Fields in September. Where is that? Yeah, it'll be a longer drive for me.
Well, Bob is now, want me to tell you?
Please,
that?
please.
Bob is now, well, I don't know where it is either. Chris, don't walk out. This is your item.
Nice try, though.
Remember we were going to go there last September. Well, Bob called me a few weeks ago, and he is now on the board of the Planting Fields Foundation, and he has invited the board to come back for its September meeting. And I conveyed it to Daniel and to Doug. He also because what has just happened, Chris? The Planting Fields Foundation has a contract to do a study.
They've hired
Patricia O'Donnell
to do a cultural landscape implementation plan, the Arboretum.
Right.
Building on the cultural landscape report, draft cultural landscape report that I prepared.
And so he also wanted a tour of the landscape, and which Chris agreed to do if we went there. And I believe Chris has spoken to the site manager and felt that that would be okay. Bob has also suggested that we go and visit that Vanderbilt House again, that's adjacent, although I wasn't sure that the board would have time to do that. So I asked Doug to bring it up. It seems that since we were supposed to go last time and we didn't, and that you all wanted to honor Bob.
I think it's important to honor Bob, and I'm more than happy to go there for the September meeting.
It's not up to me.
What's the date?
September 5th.
5th. It's not gonna be good.
Is that correct? September 5th is the date.
That sounds
Yeah,
right.
and it's right after Labor Day.
Yeah, it's
We
that
can
first week. of
maybe
Christmas.
move out a week, but that actually, well,
I don't know if that helps.
5/12.
Well, I'm sorry, I did not bring the calendar with me.
So-
I didn't realize the date would be a problem because we had so much
It's-
trouble getting the dates for
There's no
everybody.
good date. I mean, everyone's so busy. I'm certainly willing to give it a try if we could tweak the date if we had to, but I think we've already spent a lot of time worrying about when our next meeting dates are gonna be, and we should try
Yeah.
to stick to the 5th.
Is there
So, are
any
people in
chance-
favor of trying to go visit Bob at Planning Fields?
Where is it again?
You into it?
Well, I live about halfway, so.
Walking distance? Like,
Party at Kristen's house,
Party at
barbecue at
Kristen's?
Kristen's.
I have a very small house.
does anybody know that that would be prohibitive for them on September 5th as of right now?
Chris, how long does it take to get there?
From here,
What day of the week? That's a good question.
It's a Thursday,
about 3.5 hours from here.
3.5 hours from here.
Can somebody tell us what day of the week September 5th is?
Thursday.
It is a Thursday.
It's okay for me, and I must say, it's great to see the planting fields, but it would be great to see Mrs. Whitney's place, because it may not be there much longer unless we can persuade the owner to list it and to get involved in its preservation.
Oh, the Whitney?
Yeah.
Well, that is kind of a pie-in-the-sky thing, because that would involve you all, well, it would involve maybe you coming down the night before and having an early meeting and going after the meeting. You know, some people are.
Well, I mean, I think 20 minutes is enough there. I mean, really, you're just walking around seeing the decorated interiors and the wonderful landscape garden. But for people who can take that extra time, I think Bob should be encouraged to set it up, because it may move toward persuading the owner, the descendant of the
And
builder,
how
to
close are
do a
these two
nomination.
places that we're talking about?
20 minutes.
Okay.
But let's, want to start with part 1, having the meeting or not having the meeting there?
Okay. Are we in favor of having the meeting there on the 5th? Sure. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstain, okay.
And I don't have Jay and
Are
Wayne here.
people
and
open to the
Lucy's not here.
possibility of a 2-day meeting? All in favor?
Okay, nobody. Yeah.
You have to recuse yourself. You,
Wednesday, Thursday, or Thursday, Friday?
I would say Wednesday, Thursday.
Well, if Labor Day is Monday,
Oh, yeah, that's gonna stink. That's
Wait,
just
Labor
gonna.
Day's after that?
or before.
Yeah, Labor Day is the Monday of that week. So we're talking about Thursday for sure, possibly Wednesday, Thursday. So I would travel on Tuesday. Yeah, I mean, I think,
We will,
Do you want to start later on Wednesday?
yeah, maybe.
You would fly, wouldn't you?
I've driven it in the past. I drove to Jones Beach.
I know it's very difficult, and I know it's very difficult having only the 10 members.
That was so cool.
And, you know,
It's fun.
because if we had the 13, then,
more flexibility.
Yeah, we're a low-numbered board today. We're certainly gonna need to draw the others into this conversation, so I think we have a critical mass of people here that are interested in trying to do this, so let's lead with that and see who else we can get involved, and if we wanna expand it to a 2-dayer. Okay?
And check with Tom Maggs, who steps in for Lucy, so that, you know, you can be sure that that seat's covered.
where, did
That's-
Lucy leave?
Yes.
I guess.
Oh, okay. I'll have to check with Lucy then.
Okay, well, we've tried to, okay, the other thing is this June meeting, June 13th, we're trying to arrange doing the J-COPE training at the meeting. How does that grab everyone?
Well, I've already had responses from several of you.
You have 4 yeses, I believe?
I've had yeses from Wint, Paul, Wayne, and you've already done it. Jen's already done it, and.
I think I just did it last year.
Huh?
I think I'm covered.
Did you how did you do that?
I had to go downtown Buffalo and sit in an office and be
Lucy,
monitored.
but Lucy thought
I've
it
done
was-
it 2 or 3 times now.
Lucy thought it was today, so she didn't respond when I said it was June.
Yeah, I got confused about that as well. Between June and September.
You can look yourself up on the Jacob website. That's what I did
Cool.
to see when I expired.
Okay.
And I didn't, and Jay already couldn't come.
She's
today.
expired.
So I have Wayne, Wint. What about you, Chuck?
Sorry?
Chuck, what about you for the Jacob?
June's okay.
I'm sorry, June?
Okay.
She said okay. Okay. And it will be, I think it'll be Kathleen and not, Petra. So I'll have to ask Lucy if she's still okay for June. So that's,
Yeah, maybe I'll check if it's.
okay, could you just respond to me? I'm sure if it's more than if I have more than a couple, she'll do it anyway. And we would do it after the meeting, like at 1 or 1:30, whenever we're done with the nominations.
I'll bring ice cream. I'll sweeten the pot.
Awesome.
If you don't,
I'm writing that down.
can't do it, there's, Petra will provide another way for you to do it. But if no one can come, then I'll tell her no one can come, then she won't bother,
Okay.
that's all. And Kathleen was going to come to every meeting, but, she forgot she was away this meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And so she'll definitely be here in June, and she'll do the conflict of interest thing that she was gonna do today.
And how long does that take? Do we know? Is it
The conflict of interest, I think
hour and a
it's-
half?
Oh, Jacob?
Yeah.
Yeah, an hour and a half,
1.5 hours.
1.5 hours.
Is it the comprehensive ethics training course?
Yes.
Because I'm signed up to do it April 4th, so.
Okay, so then you don't have to do it in June.
Or I could just do yours.
Or
Yes,
you
you
could
can
do
do one or
June,
the other.
that's
If you
right.
have more attendance at yours, and I don't have to drive up to Albany on.
You can do it one or the other, sure.
I'm in the same situation. I've allowed myself to be scheduled for mid-April or something. I can't remember the date.
Yeah.
And I'll just cancel that if we're definitely going to do it.
Make
Yeah.
the one trip up here.
Okay, so then I have Wint, Erica, Doug, you're in,
I'm in.
Chuck.
and the others already responded.
I gotta see if I need it. But yeah.
Okay, we'll see if you need it. It's all right, I just wanted to make
And
sure we
June's
had
here?
more than one person.
Yes.
June's gonna be here, September downstate. Okay.
I'm sure it'll be a beautiful, I'm sure Chris is gonna give us a beautiful tour.
Another thing that we were gonna talk about today that we won't because Kathleen is not here is the conflict of interest policy that
Right,
we still
she'll
need to
talk
develop.
about that in June when she does the Jacob, she
The
said.
only other, Daniel, you talked about May 4th being I Love My Park Day. There's cool I Love My Park Day posters on the back table. April 5th is a Riverbank in New York City grand opening. April 27th is the Victory Tower opening in Newburgh. Those are announcements from the State Council of Parks meeting. March 4th was Park Advocacy Day, and I attended the State Council of Parks meeting here in this room like 2 weeks ago.
So you're gonna tell us about that?
Yeah, not really, because it's late. I will distribute electronically the 2018 annual report from the State Council of Parks, which is really interesting. Who was the region that did their own?
Saratoga.
Saratoga region did its own, which was a bit of a surprise for everyone. I have a copy of that people can look at. The Board for Historic Preservation is going to have future involvement in what they say about us in the annual report, and we're working towards that. But they did a great job of talking about the awards, the preservation awards, which is featured in there. And that's my report.
Did you make a report to them?
I did.
Oh, good.
But the commissioner largely covered the items that I reported to the State Council of Parks, so I'm not going to repeat that. We're mostly covered. All right? Any other issues?
But I would say that what Daniel reported on as his final report about the Washington changes, we should not be shy about mentioning it over and over again in any kind of reports, whether internal or external, or I mean, be governed by the, what the lawyers and the governor's office says, but it's just, This must not happen, and we should be noisy about it.
Agreed.
Thank you, Wayne.
Okay.
Agreed.
Motion to adjourn?
Sure.
Erica? I'll second. All in favor of adjourning?
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah.
Have to run.
Yeah. Go for it.
You have to run to the high.
I gotta run to the high.